IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. We're here today. It's the Notre Dame Recruiting Hour. These faces right here might look a little bit different than what you're used to on Monday. That's definitely not Sean Davis. I am definitely not Ryan Roberts. And we are here today to fill in. Ryan's on vacation. Sean is going to fill in for us later in the week on the mailbag. So I'm very, very much looking forward to that. Me and Sean Davis doing a mailbag, a show that typically runs 3 hours anyway, is going to be epic. So that is going to be a long mailbag. But Brian Smith is on with me today. My man, we are going to talk some recruiting, Brian. And, you know, there's been a lot of discussion lately about whether or not Marcus Freeman has improved recruiting at Notre Dame or if he's recruiting just like Brian Kelly has. I pretty much blew that notion out of the water last week. When you look at the blue chip index, the number of 4 to 5 stars that Notre Dame is bringing in, that's just the external way of evaluating myself personally, breaking down the film. There's certainly been an upgrade in recruiting. However, there's a difference between upgrading and being where you need to be. And we're still focusing, obviously, Notre Dame still has work to do to get to that level. And so today, what we're going to discuss, Brian, is we're going to dive into the 2024 class. We're going to focus on the offense today. We'll talk defense next week and look at who they have and who's left on the board and what the remaining needs are in regard to Notre Dame really putting together a second straight, in my opinion, second straight. I would think you could even argue third straight if you just look at the both definitions of gap closing type of class. I think 2023 class, no question, was a gap closing class. 22 had some spots where it was and some spots where they had misses. It's hard for me to say it's definitively a gap closing class when you strike out at safety, you know, when you only signed one receiver, as good as he may be. So what you know, you didn't land an elite quarterback. 23, definitely a gap closing class, and 24, they're trying to do the same thing. It's certainly off to a great start. And the start that they're off to right now is the great start they're off to is primarily because of the offensive staff. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to dive into what's left on the board for Notre Dame to kind of have that. Now, today's focus, Brian, is not going to be so much on the individual gap closing players. That's a time and a place for that conversation, but we're going to look at it more as units, because I think there's different ways to look at a gap closers, Brian. You've seen this in college football where a team may have a great unit, even though not one individual player from that unit may be great. You look at Michigan's offensive line, for example. You've used them as an example in recent years where there may not be a individual great player. There's no Joe Alt at Michigan. I don't even know if there's a Blake Fisher type of talent at Michigan. I don't think that there is, actually. But as a unit, they play great together. We'll look at that. Look at it from that standpoint, and then, of course, mention which players are. But Brian, when you look at it, the big thing is big picture. I think especially offensively, it's been a long time since Notre Dame has been, I think really since Charlie Weiss was here, that Notre Dame's been able to stack impact offensive classes in a row. And I think that's the opportunity they have. You look at last year's class, Kenny Minchie, top 100 player in my opinion, a very talented quarterback in a loaded quarterback year. Jeremiah Love is a guy that Notre Dame just doesn't get that kind of athlete very often. You and I have talked about that. The receiver class was outstanding. You got one of the best tight ends in a year that wasn't really loaded with a bunch of great tight ends after Deuce Robinson. Offensive line class, gap closing class. So you look at it as a whole, Notre Dame hit all their marks. Quarterback that can be big time. Elite playmakers, big guys, all of it, depth, numbers. They had absolutely a gap closing class. They need to be able to stack a second straight offensive class together, Brian, because we can talk about defense, and defense is important, and you got to be able to make stops and all that. But in today's era of college football, in last year, the two losing teams in the college football playoff semifinals scored 45 and 41 points and lost. You got to be able to score, and you need dudes to be able to do it. And that's what this 24 class is working on.
It's really so different than what it was even 6-7 years ago when it started. You can argue whatever game you want, but I think the most important game in the recent college football history was the 16 title game, because Clemson wasn't better than Alabama, but Clemson had by far the best player on the field. And you and I have had this conversation 100 times. If you can't throw the ball and they know you're throwing it and still make plays, you're done. You're not beating Alabama and Georgia. I know people talk about there's 3-4 teams in college football. There's 2 right now. Right. Ohio State's still good. Clemson's still good, but they're not on Alabama and Georgia's level. Those are the 2. That's
Clemson
the only
was,
2. Yeah, but
they're not now. Why? But what's the big difference, Brian? What's different about Clemson now compared to what it was in 16 and 18? Quarterback, playmakers are 100%. Not the same on the perimeter, are not the same.
You and I laughed about how Clemson has struggled. Why? We don't know. To sign those little shifty receivers. They always had them 20 years.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
And then they just suddenly didn't have them. It's their fault. Because there's plenty of – I live down here.
Well, they started going after the big 6'4s and those big guys. And
you got to have some balance.
Right. They didn't recruit to their offense. I mean, that's the other thing, too, is they didn't recruit to fit their offense. I think they're trending back up. I really liked their 2022 receiver class. I like the Williams kid that played last year. I'm a big Adam Randall fan. I think he's a raw kid, but I think he's got a ton of talent. Sure. They're getting there, but the quarterback position is the big one. And so when you look at Notre Dame, Brian, to your point, what's the 2024 class built around? Who are the 2 best prospects in the class right now? It's a stud quarterback and a stud receiver. And that's the thing is that's where you have to have your foundation. Yes, you've got to recruit offensive linemen and tight ends. We're going to talk about that. But to take that next step, Notre Dame has had great offensive lines and great tight ends, and they still go to the postseason and get their butts whooped, right? Because they can't consistently keep up either at quarterback and receiver, or in the case of 2018, quarterback. I think receiver, they were good in 2018, but at quarterback, they weren't there. When you start a class off with CJ Carr, and then with Cam Williams doing what he did as a junior, I think that's the place where you say, okay, that's moving the needle. That duo to start this class off is moving the needle, where now Notre Dame has one of the best quarterback receiver duos in the 24 class, and now it's about building on it.
It's going to be interesting to see what Cam can do. I don't think a lot of people realize how good he is. He plays in Chicago. Correct. Nobody talks about Chicago football anymore. I don't either. But he could play down here where I live and be a dominant player too. He's in Chicago.
Right. Well, I think the thing too is, Brian, is this is what's really helpful for Notre Dame in this class. And we're gonna kind of watch these 2 kids as we break them down. We're going to talk about CJ Carr. We're going to talk about Cam Williams. And as we break them down, Brian, I think the thing that has really benefited Notre Dame in the last couple of years is the fact that the North is starting to produce more impact athletes, and Notre Dame is tapping into it. And you and I are talking before the show about, Rocket Ismail, and we're reminiscing about the 88 team and all that. And you got to remember the big playmakers, not at quarterback, but the big playmakers on that team were not Southern kids that Notre Dame convinced to come up north. Rocket Ismail's from Pennsylvania, and Ricky Waters was from Pennsylvania. Anthony Johnson was from South Bend. Now they got their Derek Browns and Tony Ricks from the South. You always got to go all over the place, but the North just hasn't produced those kind of athletes as much. When they have, like the Nick Singletons, Notre Dame hasn't gotten them. I mean, think about who Notre Dame's best playmakers have been who's Notre Dame's most explosive playmakers have been in recent years. Will Fuller was from Pennsylvania. Josh Adams was from Pennsylvania. Those kind of guys, Tyler Eifert from Indiana, that's where they're getting them from. And I think when you look at, the clips of CJ Carr here, having a kid that to me is an elite quarterback with a great arm, great mind, athletic, he's a playmaker, as you see in these highlights. You can get that kid from 2 hours away. It doesn't happen often. And then the fact that they're able to take advantage of that, I mean, it's a great way to start, because it's a lot easier to recruit big-time athletes, Ryan, when they know who's going to throw them the football. And I don't care what some of these recruiting services say, this is a 5-star quarterback. And if he was committed to Ohio State, he'd be a 5-star by everybody. I'm just going to flat out say it. Or if even more, Brian, if he was uncommitted, he'd be a 5-star according to everybody.
I want to do that show someday.
Yes, we will. That is going to be definitely a CFB Nation show that we're going to do at some point in time. And we'll have a lot more to talk about that because, Brian, you're going to have a show. We're going to launch here
Yeah.
soon on CFP Nation, talking about Florida and Georgia recruiting. So, I mean, but that's the thing, though, Brian, is what was impressive about last year's class is that they were able to put that class together without a big-time quarterback for most of the year. Kenny Minchie doesn't commit till November. And this year they're doing it with the big-time quarterback. I mean, that throw right there is just ridiculous. That
You could
CJ
make
just
the
made.
argument that he's the most accurate quarterback in the class. He's at least in the conversation.
Yes. Yeah, I think he's in that conversation. I think he's got one of the best football minds in the class. But I think the other part, too, is where I think people are sleeping on CJ is the physical tools. I think he gets some credit. Oh, he's really smart. His grandpa was a coach or whatever. But he's physically gifted as well. And to be able to have a kid like that, it's not only going to benefit you in the 24 class, Brian, it's going to benefit you in the 25 class as well.
Receivers are going to like seeing that a big-time quarterback just signed with you, and the class before was a really good quarterback too, 100%.
Well, and the fact that CJ's doing, like, I know Notre Dame fans freaked out because he didn't visit in March, but the fact is he was doing things that were going to help them recruit because he was out nationally at these big events, and kids are watching this kid play, Brian, and you've seen him play this summer. He's a stud, and kids see that, and they want to play with that guy. I mean, you saw. We'll talk about Jason Robinson in a little bit. You know, he puts a top group out, or Final Three schools, and what's he say? He's talking to CJ Carr on Twitter about, hey, what's the move, QB1? These kids see this kid play. They know he's big time. I don't really care what the recruiting services say.
I'm supposed to see, barring something unforeseen, see CJ next weekend. They're coming down to Florida. So.
Yeah, he's a big time player. But the other part of it too is okay. You and I have discussed this. Notre Dame has had better quarterback play than people give them credit for in recent years. They just didn't develop it. Not better quarterback play, better quarterback talent. And you look at Everett Golson and Malik Zaire and Deshaun Kaiser and Brandon Wimbush and Phil Dracovic. You just didn't take advantage of it. So they've had this before. I feel better about the ability to develop quarterbacks now than I did before. Especially with the change at head coach. The big thing for me, though, is to be able to go out and land a top 50 caliber recruit at receiver from your backyard is just not something that Notre Dame has been able to do very much. And credit to this staff, a frustration for you and I in the past, Brian, would be Notre Dame would slow play local kids until they found out where they stood with the national kids. Notre Dame got on CJ Williams before he blew up. They didn't wait on him. They didn't slow play him. They had him at camp last year. They pushed for him. They got his commitment. So now when he blows up, he's already a Notre Dame commit, and he's already got his the 5-star QB in the class. Being able to get a kid like this from Chicago is rare, although they're going to have another one in 2025. It's rare, but it's so important for Notre Dame, and this is why you cannot miss out on studs from the Chicago area. When there are studs in Chicago, you need to land them. And there's no better offensive recruit right now in Chicago than Cam Williams, who's an absolute stud wide receiver.
I'm surprised that more people didn't go after him early. He's in Chicago. It's not hard to get to him. Notre Dame's fortunate. They did the right thing.
Right.
I'm surprised that Alabama and some other schools didn't, they got 5 billion people in the back office. So it's fun.
So you start off with that duo. You have a good all-purpose, all-around running back in Aeneas Williams. You've got a good top 200 caliber tight end in Jack Larson, who's a really good pass-catching weapon. You've got one of the best northern linemen in the country in Peter Jones, who's a right tackle guard type of player. You've got Anthony Knapp in the class. So I think Notre Dame is off to a very good start on offense, Brian. You've got 2 studs in the class. You've got upside in the class. You've got balance already. You've kind of struck at least one in all the positions. Now the thing is okay, is this going to be a really good class with a couple studs and a bunch of other solid players around it, or is this going to be a truly gap closing class? Because let's remind people what gap closing means. It's a two-tiered definition. Tier 1 is sort of like did it make you better? Because even if you don't land a stud, if you get better, you're closing the gap just by the very definition of it. Then there's the sort of the second tier, which is the the one you really want to be in, which is you've landed a guy that not only is a stud that closes that gap, but it's a guy that you're really taking away from those other type of programs, the guy that is as good as those guys on those other type of programs. And that's the group is like, okay, can your receiving core compete with them? And so if you have a top 5 national class, I don't care what the specifics of the individuals may be, you're closing the gap in a big way. Last year's receiver class did not have a guy that I'm discussing as a top 5 overall receiver in last year's class. But as a group, it's one of the 5 best receiving classes. That's a needle moving gap closing class. So there's the 2 tiers. And I think right now, obviously, as individuals, CJ Carr, Cam Williams, without question, are in that second tier, which is the best tier. I should probably reverse it, make that tier 1, and then the other type in tier 2. Now the question is what can you add to it? And I think that's where we dive into next, Brian. And let's begin at wide receiver, because I think this is a very important year for Notre Dame. In 2022, they came up short on numbers. Lost C.J. Williams, lost Amorian Walker. I'm not losing sleep over losing Amorian Walker. I think losing C.J. Williams is a loss. I like C.J. He was a bottom top 100 guy, which is a good player. Tobias was their number 1 guy. They kept him, but you only had 1 guy in a year where you needed numbers. That's why you're going into last season with 4 scholarship wide receivers to start the season because of injuries. You're able to, but you did get that stud. Then you follow that up with a really good 4-man class, But as we mentioned, Brian, you've got to be able to stack them. And it can't just be Cam Williams and a bunch of ass in the class. You've got to get good players to go with him. And that's going to be the key, because we know they're going to be good on the offensive line. We know they're going to be good at tight end. And the way that Notre Dame should have always been able to recruit running backs, because you don't need elite running backs to have great running back play. There's a bunch of good running backs around the country. As we found, Notre Dame's been able to find them.
Yep.
Those positions are going to be good. Can they get dynamic play at quarterback, and can they get dynamic players in the perimeter? And I think that's still a question mark about, can they stack it up year after year after year. Chancey Stuckey hit a grand slam home run in his first year. Now we got to find out if he can build that class at Notre Dame, because last year, let's be honest, he benefited from some previous relationships that he had at Baylor with Jaden Greathouse, with Braylon James, with Caleb Smith. Can you now take that and build on it to where you're selling Notre Dame this entire time? I think he can, but that's what we're going to find out. And it's going to start with, in my opinion, a guy that's a very important player who's going to be visiting next weekend and we're going to go over the whole board, is Jason Robinson. And I think that's going to be a big one.
He is one of my favorite players to watch film. I've probably watched, and I know it's highlights, I've probably watched him 4 times. I usually don't watch a ton of film. If a kid's really, really good, you don't need to. And he's running away from guys in Los Angeles. Look, there are certain areas of the country where track matters. And his high school is one of the best track programs in the country, too. That's another deal. He just makes people look dumb. And if he catches the ball, everybody just stand around and watch. Good luck trying to make an open field, one-on-one, face-to-face tackle. Better you than me. So he's just dynamic.
I think the thing I like about him too, Brian, is he's different than a lot of the receivers they have on campus. And they got a kid like that last year in Caleb Smith, not the transfer, but the kid from Texas. Yeah. Caleb Smith is a different kind of athlete than the rest of the receivers in the class and on the roster. He's 6 foot, 5'11 and a half, 6 foot, shifty, has good speed. I think very underrated speed, route runner type, not the big bodied, Jaden Greathouse or the long, tall burner, Braylon James. I think that Rico, is somewhat that way too, where Rico's more of that route runner, know how to get open type. Caleb's got some of that, but Caleb's got a little after the catch juice. And Jason Robinson he's built like a slot, but I actually think he's more of an outside receiver. And for people who like comps, the comp that I think is just like, there's been a couple receivers whose comps just make too much sense for me recently. Tobias Merriweather to T. Higgins is it makes too much sense as a comp. And then the other one for me is Jason Robinson. His comp to Jahan Dotson from Penn State is just spot on. Jahan Dotson was another guy, 5'10", 150-ish coming out of high school, people say slot, 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 slot. He spent most of his career outside and was a 1,000-yard receiver. I think first, second round draft pick coming out of the NFL draft. Yep. Just because he's small, body type wise, does not mean he can't play outside. I think he's an outside guy. Now we'll talk about his game a little bit, but the big thing is getting a kid from Poly would be huge from Notre Dame, and getting a kid with a different type of skill set and a balance out. Because you said it earlier, Brian, right? What's killed Clemson? They went away from that unique, because like they'd have, like you talked about the 2016 team. Yes, they had Mike Williams, 6'5", freaky athlete. They had Deion Kane, who was 6'2", 6'3", burner. But who else do they have? Artavis Scott, 5'10 and a half, shifty, route runner type, make plays after the catch. Hunter Renfro. Like they had a really nice balance of body types on that team. The 2016 team was very similar. The 2018 team had the two trees outside, and then you got Hunter Renfro in the slot, completely different type of kid. And then you got a running back out of the backfield that can make plays. They had variant skill sets. And I think that's something that Notre Dame needs to rely on. Yes, get the trees, get the Samarshes, the Stovall's, the Michael Floyds, the Tobiases, the Deion Colesys. Yes, need those. But putting the Rico Floreses, the Caleb Smiths, the Jason Robinsons along with that is really important. And Jason brings something very unique, but he also comes from an area, Brian, where if you can start getting more of a foothold in there, it's gonna help you. It really is gonna help you. And this kid is a unique. Look, he's listed a 5'10". Maybe he's 5'10". Maybe.
I doubt it.
Yeah, maybe. If he was 6 feet tall, he's a top 100 national player, in my opinion. There's no doubt about it in my mind. But I can live with that because we've seen evidence of that type of player being able to be dynamic in college. You look at not just Jahan Dotson. We've seen a lot of guys like this. Penn State's had two kids like this in recent years. KJ Hamler wasn't much bigger than him either. You look at Rondell Moore. You look at the kid that Louisville had a couple years ago, whose name right now is Tutu Atwell. Another guy, 5'8", 5'9". If you use a kid like this correctly, you can be successful. And I think that the change in offensive coordinator, this is in no way a knock on Tommy Rees. This is just a statement of fact. The change in offensive coordinator means, Brian, we're going to see more RPOs, more quick game, more screen game. And I think that even more adds to the need for a guy like this, who is a great route runner, but can also do things after the catch. So to me, if you can partner Cam Williams, who's a tall, long, vertical, strong, win at the point of attack, get over top type of player, with a guy like Jason Robinson, I mean, that's a really ideal 1-2 punch to have a receiver in this class. So to me, he's at the top of my must-get list for the receivers in this class.
Would you start Robinson at slot or outside, or just throw the book at him?
I'd probably start him at X and then move him. I'd want the day he gets on campus, I want him to understand you're not lining up at one spot. So let's just get used to knowing what to do now. I'd start him at X and then play him at Z. I'd have him at those two spots would be where I'd move him. I mean, he'd have to understand, because the other thing too is if you ever spoken to him, and I've talked to Ryan Roberts about this, I've talked to other sources about this. If you ever talk to Jason, you're like, this kid's just, he gets it. He's smart. He just can consume football information. And I think that's another thing that Notre Dame likes about him too, is this isn't just an athletic kid from Poly. He is that. But this is a kid that fits at Notre Dame, that gets Notre Dame, and his football knowledge is just really outstanding. And I think that's why I think he can handle more. Some kids can't, Brian. Some kids are just really raw, and you say, look, I'm going to play you right here until you figure it out. Jason's the kind of kid I think you bring in, and he's going to have the football acumen to say, hey, we're going to play at these two spots. We're going to move you around. We're going to go in motion. We're going to do all these kind of things. And that's stuff you have to do with a kid who's on the smaller side. You don't just line him up at X and say, okay, let's have you win off the snap every single time against a 6-foot cornerback. You do things to make life tougher for that cornerback. And I think this staff is the pass game we're going to see out of Jared Parker is more built to taking advantage of that a little bit. The players have talked about, we got some air raid principles mixed in. He can better take advantage of this type of athlete than Tommy Rees could. And again, that's not better or worse. It's just different. And I think because it's different, it only adds to why a kid like this is so important.
Him coming from where he does, for people out there that don't know, at one point, and I don't know the numbers now, Poly had produced more players than any other school in the country, not just California, to reach the National Football League. That is a rather impressive statistic. Even to be in that discussion is
Yeah.
an impressive. People that come out of there, when they make a splash, whether it's UW, Oregon, USC, or whatever, people pay attention. This will help Notre Dame in the greater Los Angeles and California area.
Yeah. So then, Brian, right now it's Cal and Colorado and Notre Dame. He's coming on campus next weekend. We have a story at Irish Breakdown about it that Ryan Roberts did. It's a big weekend for him. Last time he was on campus, it was snowy. And it was the Boston College game, Brian, if you remember that snow. And I was a little nervous about a kid from Poly coming during that.
Yeah,
but then you see pictures of him afterwards, him and his brother having a snowball fight. They're making snow angels. Like, they loved it, right? So it's like, whew, okay, bullet dodged. Well, now he's going to come on campus. It's supposed to be really nice this weekend. We had Easter yesterday. It was gorgeous here in South Bend. It was like 60, low 60s, no wind, just beautiful day. We had the back door open all day, so our girls could just go in, and our dogs could just go in and out and be outside. So beautiful day. It's going to be great weather, and so this is your chance to make a big impression with him, Brian. And
absolutely,
if you can knock that one out of the park, you're going to have a great chance to land him. So that's where Notre Dame is with Jason Robinson, and I think he's a big one. So he's a must get. And then after that, Brian, you start getting to an interesting group of players. And there's several guys on the board for Notre Dame right now. And to me, you've got to get one of these guys. And I have my preferences on who I like more, and everyone's going to have those. But the fact is, these are all good football players. And if you can get one of these players, I feel really good about it. And it's Micah Gilbert, who's from North Carolina, who just put Notre Dame in his top 7 yesterday. You've got Isaiah Canyon from Georgia, Warner Robins, same high school as Chancey Stuckey, really dynamic athlete, raw receiver because he plays quarterback, he plays a little receiver, he plays corner. Very talented kid, very raw. And then Bredell Richardson are the 3 that I say of that trio. If you can get one of those 3, now all of a sudden, and you're able to get Jason Robinson, that's how you stack up classes in back-to-back years, Brian. And they're all different types of kids. I know Bredell's a lot smaller than those other 2 kids, but even at 6'1", 180, Bredell Richardson plays like Bredell Richardson plays like a bigger receiver. I mean, his ball skills for a 6'1", 185-pound guy are very good. He can be an outside guy. You put him and Cam Williams and Jason Robinson together, you can put those 3 kids on the field together. Because you could put Bredell in the slot and do some things with him in the slot using his ability. You can put Jason in the slot. Same thing with Micah Gilbert. Micah Gilbert, to me, is more of a boundary guy, so you'd have Cam Williams to the field because Cam can play both outside spots, in my opinion. But you have him there. You look at Isaiah Canyon can be either outside guy. You give me one of those 3 guys, Brian, I'm feeling really good about where the receiving core is right now. Really good.
If you don't get back-to-back classes, and I know you guys talk about this all the time, that are good at certain spots that there's no nice way to say it, have more value than others. Like a 5-star guard is not the same as a 5-star receiver. It's just not. But if you start getting a lot of good players on the perimeter, which is traditionally where Notre Dame has struggled more, Tim Brown has not been around a lot of times. You know what I mean? So if they can do that, they can go into any game and force somebody even as good as Kirby Smart. I think he's as good at DC as there is in college football to do things differently and not just roll them out there. Because the last few times Notre Dame's played those kind of teams, they just haven't had the quarterback play to be multidimensional. They just haven't. And part of that's on the coaching, part of that's on the player, and whatever. But you start getting receivers like Jason Robinson to put in the slot. If you want to run your base defense, by all means, go ahead. Heck, Notre Dame could run 22 against that. As long as Robinson or somebody like him's in the game, you're going to have a linebacker or a strong safety on him, you're going to get smoked. So Notre Dame just never has those guys. And much like Clemson, again, I don't understand why Clemson went away from that. Notre Dame needs one of those at least every other year that's a slot/dynamic guy, at least every other year.
Yes, agree. They need that variety, and they just haven't been able to put the receiving impact with the quarterback impact together. 100%. I think 2018 was one of the best receiving cores in the country. But it once you got to the postseason, it was somewhat negated because you didn't have the quarterback that could make the throws.
100%.
I've said it before. Trevor Lawrence, Tua Tagovailoa, Kyler Murray, Ian Book, right? One of these things does not look like the others, right? And that was the guy that was lining up under center for Notre Dame. 2 years later, Mac Jones, Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence, Ian Book. And, Ian Book, nice, solid player, tough kid, gritty, good leader, but just not a guy that's going to put a team on his shoulders. Because those other teams have those athletes, Brian, and the quarterback. Notre Dame has lacked at times the athletes and the quarterback. You know what I mean? And so that's why it's such a great start. So I think you give me those 3 kids, and I feel really good about where you are. And then if you're able to get them somewhat soon, like by the end of the summer, then you can go out and say, okay, we believe we're going to have a great offense this year. And we believe, I'm talking about looking at it from the coach's standpoint, we believe we're going to have a great offense. We believe we're going to score a bunch of points. And if we do, we can do one of 2 things. We can load up on 25 studs in that class. Tylen Taylor is another Chicago area kid that Notre Dame absolutely must get in the 25 class. Likes Notre Dame a lot, but he's going to be already is a national recruit. Georgia's already offered him. Ohio State's already offered him. You know, so it helps with that. But if you start putting those numbers up, and all of a sudden, hey, Ryan Wingo, you want to rethink, you know, kind of what you're looking at, and you start looking at some of those other national receivers, Ryan, and saying, hey, you guys may want to rethink what you're doing here. But I think the other thing too is, Ryan, is what's important about getting a guys from this group too is this fact. And I'm gonna throw this to you because I know you've watched a lot more of the national film than I have. There's a couple studs at receiver in this 25-24 class. Jeremiah Smith is a stud. Ryan Wingo's a stud. But outside of that, there's not a lot of studs at receiver in this class. There's just a lot of really good players. And I think for Notre Dame, if you can load up on just 3 of those really good players, I think another stud is Cam Williams, who Notre Dame already has. You're a top 50 kid, you're a stud. It's not like this a year where there's just a bunch of top 50 receivers. At least shouldn't be top 50 receivers. So it's not so much about landing top recruits other than Cam Williams. It's more about you just got to get, of that group of really good players, you've got to get a couple of them. And that's what Jason Robinson and those other guys are to varying degrees. So I think that if you can load up on that kind of class in a year that's not necessarily loaded at the top with receivers, I think that only adds to the impact of getting that type of 3-man receiver class, in my view. What say you, Mr. Smith?
Jeremiah Smith's the best player in the country. I've said that numerous times. I've seen him a bunch of times.
You're talking about regardless of position.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And when I say that, I say it not just because of his physical skills. I've been around him God knows how many times. The way he carries himself academically, the way he speaks to the media, the way he even warms up, says National Football League. Everything he does is for one objective, and that's to go as high in the draft as he possibly can. End of negotiation. Not a lot of kids have his maturity. Throw him away, and there's still a lot of other good ones. McClellan, the kid from St. Louis, I like a lot. There's some other kids, Texas kids and stuff. But, yeah, Jeremiah to me is like on his own stratosphere. There's a few. Wingo's kind of up there, but he's a little more raw.
Right.
There's a lot of speed guys that need some development, similar to a certain guy that came to Notre Dame last year.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with those, because usually as a sophomore, they figure it out. Spring ball and all that kind of helps. But to your point, if Notre Dame can get just 3, what you already have a Cam, I assume they're going to get the young man from Poly.
Well, they have a shot. We're going to find out better next weekend. They have a shot. I mean, I think.
No offense, but if they lose him to Cal or Colorado, that's a problem.
Agree.
I'm just calling it like it is.
Agree.
But then if they do get him, let's say by May 1st or whatever, you got the entire summer to get one freaking guy.
Right.
That's a good player.
Right.
I can't really see how that wouldn't work out, because Stuckey has proven he likes to recruit, and he's pretty darn good at it. The kids from his area in Warren Rock. If you said, give me that kid Robinson right now, I'd sign right on up.
Here's a kid I want to talk about, because this is something I like about Chancey Stuckey and the offensive staff. They don't care about recruiting rankings. And a perfect example is the Isaiah Canyon kid from Georgia.
Oh,
I think he's a consensus 3-star, I believe. I'm looking it up now. I believe he's a consensus 3-star.
Yep.
But they don't care, because they look at the kid and they say, but he has what we're looking for. He has the talent we want. He has the talent we're looking for, and we think he can be really good. So rankings be darned. And so there's some higher ranked kids that like Notre Dame that Notre Dame has kind of backed off of, because they like some of these other guys better. They like Micah Gilbert more than you'd think based on his ranking. He's a top 250 kind of guy. A couple services don't even have him that high, but Notre Dame looks at him and says, no, this is a good football player. Isaiah Canyon's another example. The only two services that have him ranked right now are On3 and 24/7 Sports. They have him ranked as the number 50 and 42 players in the state of Georgia.
I can answer why that is in a second.
Right. But Chancey sees this kid and is like, I don't care what his rankings are.
No.
This is a dude who's measured in this summer at 6'3", 198 pounds and ran a 4.51 laser time. And I think that's the other thing too, Brian, is for Notre Dame to get the studs, or to get I shouldn't say get the studs, to get the talent at the skill positions that they're going to need. The reality is, and Notre Dame fans have to embrace this fact, unless it's a kid like a Cam Williams who's from your backyard, a Will Fuller who's from the North, to get those type of kids, a corner and receiver, you're going to have to be great evaluators. And that's exactly what they were with Benjamin Morrison, who was not a top 300 guy, according to anyone except for Irish Breakdown. That's the only people that said he was a top 100 recruit. You're going to have to get those guys. And they're not going to be sexy. They're not going to make the fans who obsess over recruiting rankings happy, if we're being honest. But the fact is these are the kind of kids that Notre Dame is going to have to find. Not the whole class, because, again, they've got Cam Williams, who's a top 50 recruit. They're going to have to find some kids like this, like Jason Robinson, who I think is very underrated nationally, the Benjamin Morrisons, the Leonard Moores, who's another guy that I think is a top 150 caliber recruit that's nowhere close to being ranked properly. They're going to have to find those guys at skill positions. And that's what I like about Chancey Stuckey so far, is he's willing to go after those guys, and he doesn't really care what the recruiting rankings say. I think that's important. And Chad Bowden's the same way. They just don't care about that stuff. And the film's got to determine what you're looking at, not offer lists or whatever else. You have to have conviction in your ability to evaluate film. Which, Brian, another example, Jadarian Price. You and I both said when we saw that kid, I saw the film, you saw him in person, that's the top 100 recruit. I don't care what anybody says. And what does he do when he shows up at Notre Dame last spring? He's the best running back they have on the roster. Better than Audric Estime, better than Logan Diggs, better than Chris Tyree.
I watched him absolutely destroy a Dallas team for 299 yards rushing, and it doesn't count the 100-plus yards receiving that he had. And I'm like, I don't know what y'all are doing with these rankings, but these eyes don't lie. He was making guys miss with sheer speed when they had the angle, and it was just comical. Yeah. It was just comical. So, yeah, that was a terrible ranking. A little note on our guy from Warner Robins that we're watching here. He plays at one of the best programs, not only in the state of Georgia, but in Dixie. Mm-hmm. That coaching staff, the way the community rallies around it, everything they do is like a college program. I've witnessed it from 5 feet away, watched them warm up, every little drill and all that. They are a roadshow. Wherever they go, that place will sell out, blah, blah. It's a big deal. For you to be behind center at Warner Robins and to play multiple spots, people outside, this area may not understand it, but I can tell you that's a very big honor. They believe in him because when they lose a game, it's like national news, from a local perspective. They just don't get beat. So it's important to note that he is the face of their program. So that means a lot to me personally.
And he plays quarterback, receiver, and DB. He's got 100%. Some impressive DB film on here, too, as you're about to see right here, speak of the devil.
I could see him playing free safety in a heartbeat.
Yeah. So guy like that is definitely someone to keep an eye on. We talked about Breedell Richardson, Ryan. He's another one that I like a lot. Now, Breedell plays the social media game very well. And I actually rather enjoy how he does it. I mean, he's very good at brand building. But he does have legitimate interest in Notre Dame. That's the thing. People say, well, he's not really interested. He's just using Notre Dame fans to build up his brand. Well, he is using Notre Dame fans as well as every other fan base to build up his brand. Just smart. Kudos to the kid. But, Brian, you've had a chance to talk to Breedell. You've seen him in person. You know where he's from. His interest in Notre Dame is legit at this point in time. Will they get him? I don't know. But his interest in Notre Dame is legit.
Breedell is somebody I text with like I would text with you. He's right down the road from where I've lived. And I know that program well. Notre Dame's recruiting 3 or 4 kids from that school, yada, yada. It's a great program. And Breedell is not your typical Florida kid. Very astute. He understands big picture. He wants a good degree, but he also wants to be coached up. And he's, as they say, looking for the perfect fit. He doesn't care if he goes close, if he goes far. He doesn't care about the weather. Doesn't care about any of that. It's just comfort and fit. So where he ends up, like I've had this, he has no freaking
Right.
idea. If they're going to finish their receiver class this summer, I would bet that Breedell would not be the guy, because I don't know if he'll be ready to decide in June. He may, but like right now, he's 5-6 schools. He's not sure. So that'll be interesting.
Yeah, and this is some sophomore film of Breedell. And as I said, he's listed as 6'1", 180, but he plays a much bigger than that, in my opinion. But I think the thing too, Brian, is this staff right now is targeting 3 receivers. But I think because you got 4 last year, because you have Cam, if you're able to get one other guy this summer, you don't have to rush. You don't have to say, boy, we gotta panic and take a third guy just because. And I also think there's a situation where if the right players want to come, I think they would go to 4.
And like if Ryan Wingo wants
to
come
right
at the end, and he might be a National Signing Day kid.
Sure, why not? Right?
I mean, there are just certain guys that when you make out your board and you have X number allotment for this spot, it's like,
yeah.
You know, do you think Lou Holtz wasn't going to take Raghib Ismail's call?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just, I've heard the stories about Paterno ranting and raving about him picking Notre Dame in Rocket's driveway or whatever. But there's certain guys you just go to bat for, and you kind of figure it out later. So that's true.
So right now, I think like I said, the group is 3. I think they have a really good, healthy number of receivers on the board right now, Brian. I think that's a smart strategy. You don't say, okay, these are the 2 we want, so we're going to recruit them only, or we need 2 more, so we're only going to recruit 3. I mean, there's 5-6 guys on the board for 2 spots, and then there's some other receivers that they're either keeping an eye on or that are unlikely guys to go right now that they're still saying, hey, maybe a good season could help move the needle a little bit. Because I think right now, I mean, it's impressive that they've been able to get the receivers they've gotten when you consider what their pass game looked like last year. That's going to change this year a lot, in my opinion, when you look at the perception of what this offense is like when you have Sam Hartman at quarterback. And that was going to, no matter who the OC was, that the offense is going to look a lot different this year. I mean, if you say whatever you want about Tom Reese, but the guy had a 3,000-yard quarterback in Jack Cohn the year before, and I love Jack, big Jack Cohn fan. But Jack's not the passer that Sam Hartman is. He's not.
No, he's not as accurate.
Right. And he doesn't throw the deep ball as well. Sam Hartman's arguably the best deep ball thrower and coming back in college football. So that's going to change some things. I think it's smart, too, for Notre Dame not to panic at that position as well, because of that fact right there. Is when people see our offense, it's going to help us as well in 24 and 25. But I really like the board where they're at. Like I said, if they get 2 guys from the board we talked about, right? Breedell, Richardson, who we're looking at now, two guys from Jason Robinson, Breedell, Richardson, Isaiah Canyon, Micah Gilbert. You give me 2 guys from that group. There's a couple other receivers on the board that they're looking at. Then I'm going to feel good about where Notre Dame is when it comes to recruiting the wide receiver position for a second year. That give me 2 of those guys, and that is a gap closing receiver haul when you put them with Cam Williams.
One final note to put a bow on the wide receiver. To your point, this needs to be, barring something unusual with the number of scholarships in a year, the norm. What you just said as a possibility needs to be the norm. Now, I'm not saying that every year you're going to get 3 guys that are top 200 receivers. That's probably not realistic, even for Alabama. Every now and then things just fall through. But at least 3 out of 4 years, if you're going to compete for top 5 to top 8 in the playoffs, and preferably top 4, and you're not going to get there without like you said, what was it, 45 and 41 or the point totals or whatever? I mean,
of the losers.
Yeah, I know.
The losers in the semifinals. Yeah.
So that may have been one of the weirder years for playoffs or whatever.
Not really. I mean,
but I know up to this point, but if maybe the defenses, they changed some rules or whatever, but it's still easier just to be in the shotgun. You could almost just tell a defense, look, we're on the 7-yard line here. Your unbelievable top 5 pick is going to be worthless on this next play because we're throwing a fade ball. Right. That's how you beat Georgia and those teams. You're not going to out-recruit Georgia's D-line recruiting. You're not. It is insane. You have to win further out. I know Notre Dame fans don't want to hear that, but I go to all these high school camps down there. They have way more guys right there.
As good as Notre Dame's offensive line is going to be, you're never going to bully Georgia.
You can run for a buck
You can
50,
you
but you're
can
not going to run for 280.
but the point is you can
Yeah,
neutralize them. That's the best you're going to
100%.
do.
Yep.
And so your ability to win or not, to your point, is going to come on the perimeter.
Over the top, baby.
And you have to do both, because I think the thing that hurt Ohio State last year was they could win on the perimeter, but they couldn't win and they couldn't neutralize Georgia up the middle, which
Their
allowed
O-line
Georgia to get
wasn't
some pressures late in the game. Yes.
their O-line wasn't quite as good run blocking. Of course, they had injuries
Right.
at running back,
A
which
ton of
really,
injuries. Right.
yeah, no, sometimes, again, that just, it happens.
But that's part of college football. That's why you need to be good
1000%.
everywhere. So if you are banged up somewhere, because what
You can
allowed
switch it
Ohio
up.
State to stay in that game is the fact that they couldn't run the ball effectively. They couldn't beat them in the trenches, but what could they do? They could make plays on the perimeter.
Oh, they killed Georgia on the perimeter. And Georgia's got DBs too. It's not like they're lacking physical skill on the perimeter. They got 5 stars at every position.
Right.
So hats off to Ohio State staff for still finding a way. And
that's where Notre Dame's got to get to, Brian. And again, some of these guys aren't going to be highly ranked guys, but they started off well this year. You gotta have it year 2. Second point, you have to be able to be strong consistently at the positions that are normal strengths for you. I think that's the next question mark for us as we move into the offensive line recruiting. That's the next area. You already have 2 kids in the class, Peter Jones and Anthony Knapp. Peter Jones is a right tackle guard. Anthony Knapp, tackle guard. We'll see. I think the staff is going to give him a shot to play tackle. He's kind of got a body very similar to Jarrett Patterson, except that he's got 34-inch arms, where Jarrett Patterson was like 31-inch arms. That matters when you're talking about a guy with a chance to play tackle.
Huge.
Guy, we'll have conversations about that. Right now, the target number, Brian, is 3 offensive linemen. They'll take a 4th if number 3 commitment is not Gearby Lambert. And I think that, to me, is offensive line recruiting is the one position on offense that I'm a little, I don't want to say concerned, say puzzled is a safer, I'm the new coach. I'm still trying to figure out who he likes and who he doesn't like. There's some uncertainty there. Does he like Kevin Haywood or not? I don't love his film. I loved Caleb Brewer's film. Joe Rudolph doesn't. I think that's a mistake, is what it is. There's Styles Prescott, the kid who's from the Indianapolis area kid. The fact of the matter is, Brian, you mentioned earlier, there's some guys that just can come whenever the heck they want to come. And the reality is that's Gearby Lambert in the offensive line class. So I'm telling you, they want to take 3. If they get a 3rd guy, then the O-line board shrinks to 1 dude, and it's Gearby Lambert. I mean, they're going to take him in this class if they can get him. He's going to be here for the blue gold game. It's imperative that Notre Dame knock that visit out of the park, because he is the difference between this being an okay offensive line class that raises questions about, can Joe Rudolph recruit at the level needed to at Notre Dame? And yes, okay, they're going to be just fine. And that he is that important to this class, because as I've mentioned several times before, Brian, I don't think you've had a chance to talk about this on the show, so you can either agree or disagree with me here. This is not a great offensive line class nationally. It's not. It's not a very deep class. There's not a lot of pure tackles in this class. There's a lot of interior type of kids. It's not a typical great class of offensive linemen, which even heightens the need for you to get Gearby Lambert because of that, and the fact that tackle is still one of the biggest needs you have in this class overall. You need at least 1 pure tackle in this class, and at least 2 guys that can play tackle. Between Jones and Knapp, 1 of them can play tackle. It's imperative. He might be the most important. I would actually argue this and say it pretty confidently. There's no offensive player left on the board more important to the success of this offensive haul, on top of the kids they already have, of the uncommitted kids, than Gearby Lambert. Not receivers,
nobody else like him.
Exactly, because the board, like we just talked about receiver, Ryan. Like there's 5, 6, 7 kids. We could talk about Emmett Mosley. There's some other guys they're looking at where it's like you got to just get 2 of those guys. And offensive tackle is like, if you don't get Gearby Lambert, I'm not going to love your tackle class unless you can go flip some big time kid that right now is not really giving you much time. Like Andrew Sprague with the Michigan was a guy that they looked at. They didn't love him. I didn't love him. He's a big tough kid that doesn't move real well. It's just not a great offensive line class. If you don't get Gearby Lambert, your future at tackle is looking a little shaky, to where, boy, if Jagasol and Emil Wagner don't pan out, you could be in trouble at offensive tackle. That is, Notre Dame cannot be there. They cannot be there. And Gearby Lambert is one of the solutions to fixing that problem. In my opinion, he's that good and that important in both areas.
That's the one position historically, and true to this day, because this upcoming year will be as good a 1-2 punch at tackle as any school has had in the last 25 years.
Yeah.
As
And
far
that's
as
saying a lot when you
Oklahoma.
consider the tackle tandems that Notre Dame has had
That's what I
in
mean.
recent years. I mean, Zach
Yeah,
Martin and Ronnie Stanley
yeah,
Stanley,
they have more physical
and
skill.
Mike McGlinchey and Alex Bars, Mike McGlinchey and Robert Hainsey. You know what I mean? Like, they've been loaded at tackle. And to say what
Yep.
you just said and me not
And
to
I'm
say, hold on a
steadfast.
second, dude. Hold on. No, I'm not saying that you're nuts for this. They could be that good this
Just the
year, Brian.
physical skill, the upside of those two is higher than anything they've had. It's just Joe Alt, I think, is the best offensive lineman in the country. But that's just
Agree.
and
And you could
Fisher's going
argue
to
Blake
be
Fisher has as
over
high
a
of a ceiling as Joe Alt does. Just
he's
God-given ability.
over a year now from that injury he had against the Knowles. I don't know, but he could, because what was it? He was reported to be down to 315, 320, something like that. He was
310 this
350.
spring. Yeah,
Oh, really?
310 this spring.
I was
Yeah.
told at one point he was over 350, which looking at
In
him
high school.
when he was first got coming in, I was like, probably need to get on the treadmill a little bit. He's lost the weight. He's in better shape. And of course, his technique's gotten better. Show me something even close to those two at tackle. And you can pick the school. I'll give you the field.
Mm-hmm.
So Notre Dame should be able to show that to Lambert or whatever player and say, look, I'm not saying you're those guys, but there's a reason they came here to continue this tradition. It's ridiculous what we do at O-line. Why would you not want to join this?
Right.
It's not a hard pitch. I just did it for, it's not a hard pitch. The academics are there. The history's there. You're on the verge of going to the playoffs every year. It's not a real hard pitch to sell Notre Dame to an offensive tackle.
Because what do kids want to know? Can I go, big time players, can I go there and become an NFL draft pick? I would argue that no team in the country in the last decade has done a better job of producing big-time NFL players than Notre Dame has at left tackle. And I don't care what – you can take D-line for nobody, because every team has had guys that don't hit at every now and then. Sure. Notre Dame's last 5 – we're projecting Joe Alt to be a first-round pick next year, which everyone that I know has him there, barring injury. Your last 5 left tackles, your last 5 starting left tackles are going to be the number 16 overall pick, Zach Martin, the number 6 overall pick in Ronnie Stanley, the number 9 overall pick in Mike McGlinchey, the number 48 overall pick, second rounder in Liam Eichenberg, and then whatever Joe Alt is about to be. That's your last 5 starting left tackles.
That's okay.
There's nobody that can have that kind of track record. And it would be under 3 different coaches. Right? That's the thing, is like you have Jeff Quinn and Harry Hiestand both contributed to that. Now, Harry Hiestand, I think, deserves a lot of credit for the development of Joe Alt, but Joe Alt was pretty good as a true freshman before Harry Hiestand got here, and Jeff Quinn recruited him. You have to give Jeff Quinn – look, I've had a lot of negative things to say about Jeff Quinn. The fact is he's the one that recruited Joe Alt and coached him as a freshman All-American. He deserves credit for that. So you can't just say, well, you only produced that under Harry Hiestand. You can't really say that. Now, of course, Harry Hiestand was the legend. He was the guy that built this tradition.
Yes, he was.
Which it didn't exist in the time between when Joe Moore left and when Harry Hiestand showed up. Let's be honest about that. They had some Mike Rosenthal's and Luke Pettigut's, but they weren't producing offensive linemen like they did under Joe Moore. Let's be real about that. Harry Hiestand started that, but my point is you can sell it as, yes, Harry Hiestand was the legend, but Jeff Quinn is the guy that recruited Blake Fisher and Joe Alt. And he also recruited, Harry Hiestand did that. But I'm like thinking of some of the other guys that they're going to have. You could kind of give him Tommy Reese recruited Billy Schrauth. That's a whole nother thing. The point is, there's going to be multiple coaches that, if Joe Alt and Blake Fisher are as good as we think they can be, a lot of credit's going to be given to Harry Hiestand, but also some to Joe Rudolph, rightfully so. And I think that's the selling point, is because the negative recruiting thing that's going to take place, Brian, is, well, yeah, but that was all Harry Hiestand did all that. If Joe Alt's a top 10 pick, which you and I think both agree that he probably will be, then, well, that's not a Harry Hiestand guy. Harry would have coached him one of his 3 years and didn't recruit him. All right, and this isn't saying anything negative about Harry Hiestand. It's just to make the point that you can't negatively recruit that if these 2 kids pan out, because they will have spent more time under non-Harry Hiestand years than they will have under Harry Hiestand. And I think that's an important selling point, because you know this, Brian. That's what if you're at Georgia right now and you're recruiting against Notre Dame for an offensive lineman, is that not what you're saying? Hey, you look, all those big time NFL guys, they were all Harry Hiestand guys. What have they done other than Harry Hiestand? And it's a legitimate it's a legitimate negative recruiting tactic, is it not? So if these two kids pan out and you can have a pushback, like, hey, look, these kids played for 3 years and Coach Hiestand did a great job, but he only coached them for 1 year. Like that just wipes that negative recruiting tactic out, in my opinion.
I think Georgia just tries to sell their program at this point. At least that's what I would do.
Okay, pick another school. You get the point that I'm making when I talk about negative.
Georgia is hard to recruit against. Right?
Okay, pick another school. But see, but my point is that's the one position that they can.
Yeah, Georgia is great, but Notre Dame's just as good as any school in the country, Iowa, Alabama, Wisconsin, whatever, at recruiting offensive linemen, producing them to the point where they go into the NFL and they're not just drafted, but they're successful. Was it the 19 season? 3 of the top 5 for all NFL. Stanley, Martin, and a guy by the name of Nelson were all pro. 3 out of the top 5. I don't know if that's ever happened before from one institution. That's pretty random. So yeah, it can't be that hard to recruit a line to Notre Dame.
And moral of the story, Brian, we can run through the names. There's guys on the board that are good players. Kevin Haywood's big, strong kid. Styles Prescott is an in-state kid that I like, but he's a bit raw, needs some work. Grant Bricks is okay. Aiden Lynch is a kid they're looking at.
I love Bricks. Yeah. I like his athleticism.
But I just don't think he's a tackle. That's my problem.
Well, no, I think he's more Quentin Nelson-like.
But that's the point.
You can play him right tackle, but he's better at right guard. I don't disagree.
Yeah. And that's kind of my concern there. Kevin Haywood, to me, big, strong, physical kid, but he's more of a right tackle at this point in time. The reason Gearby is unique is because Gearby's got all the tools to be a left tackle. Now, I know he played right tackle his first couple of years, but I don't care about that. He's got left tackle tools, and you have to get them. As simple as that. This class won't be as good as it can be if you don't get Gearby Lambert in this class. It won't be. You have to.
Is there anybody else they would be trying to flip, and or you could see them circling back to? For whatever reason, if Lambert doesn't work, he gets hurt. He just decides he doesn't want to go to Notre Dame.
You kind of have to. I don't know. Like right now, I don't know that the board looks great for that. I mean, because the one thing about Coach Hiestand is, his board for 24 was small. It's always small. That's just the way the Coach Hiestand recruits. And again, I've said I don't have a problem with that. I think you've kind of burned the bridge a little bit with Caleb Brewer. And they didn't view him as a tackle. I mean, Ian Moore's an in-state kid, but I think he's all Ohio State right now. And he's a guard, in my opinion, in Notre Dame.
Yeah,
I think you can play right tackle at Ohio State because that's a different type of offensive run scheme and different system. But at Notre Dame, he's a guard. And I don't say that as an insult because the greatest lineman Notre Dame's had the last 20 years is a guard. Andrew Sprague, I wouldn't try to, I'm fine, whatever. I'm just, it's not a great year. That's the problem. I mean, Brandon Baker from modern day is a stud, but you're not going to get that kid. You're just not going to get him. So that's the reason that makes Gearby so important, O'Brien, because it's not a loaded year where you can just, it's fine. If we don't get him, we get some other guy. There's not a lot of guys like him in this year's class. Like last year, there were so many good tackles in last year's class, Brian. I mean,
isn't it wild how it goes?
It really is. It was just a really good tackle year in college football. High school football.
Well, which one of these guys would you say, if you take Gearby out of it, would be next in line? Would it be the kid from Fisher's, Prescott, or?
For me, it would. Yeah. Now
he's very raw. I know that.
Yes.
He's long as hell.
He is. Now, some people might say Kevin Haywood, who I believe is ranked a little bit higher. I like Kevin Haywood. I'm just not sure I see the upside with him. I think he's one of those high school kids that's just kind of bigger and stronger than everybody else. He's played at like 3 different high schools. I don't know why. It's just always kind of a weird thing for me. But when I look at the kid at Prescott and Ryan, I think Prescott needs some work. I think he's raw. We were talking earlier about the kid from Warner Robins. That kid's going to be coached, right? Styles Prescott's a kid that's going to need a lot of coaching, but he's got the tools. I mean, he's a big kid. I think he moves pretty well. His technique is let's just say leaves a lot to be desired, but I think he's got all the other tools that you want. He's strong, he's athletic, he's long, just needs to be coached. And for me, I don't care if an offensive lineman needs to be coached. That's what offensive line coaches are paid 6-7 figures to do. Right. And this is the kind of, and this is why I think Coach Easton liked him. Coach Easton brought him on campus, sized him up perfectly, or sized him up. And as soon as he realized that the kid had because that's the thing about Coach Easton, he likes to see you face to face before he gives you an offer. He wants to see what your arm length is like. He wants to read your demeanor. He wants to talk to you face to face and find out if you have what it takes to be a Notre Dame offensive lineman. He valued what a Notre Dame offer meant. You know what I mean? And so when it meant something. So when Styles visited in the winter, and Coach Easton met him face to face and immediately offered, that said something to me, right? And Brian, it's like you and I have known each other, gosh, it's been 20 years now, right? And I remember you and I talking about Zach Martin. Remember how much we used to go crazy when Notre Dame was not pushing for him? They wanted Michael Schofield over Zach Martin. And the thing that you and I talked about time is like, look, this is Kirk Ferentz's number one offensive lineman on the board. And if Kirk Ferentz has him as number one offensive line on the board, I don't need to know anything else. Right. And that's the thing was if Harry Hiestand says, I like this kid, I'm going to somewhat give him the benefit of the doubt and realize that there's some tools there. And that's what I like about Styles. He's going to need work. He's raw, all that good stuff. But at least he has the tools to eventually be that guy who could potentially be a left tackle, Brian. I mean, will he be a left tackle? I don't know. He needs work, but he's got the tools to be so. And honestly, Brian, if it's a perfect world for me, I'd love to see Styles commit like soon. And then Notre Dame's going to still keep recruiting Gearby and then bring in Gearby and make it that 4-man class. That would be a sort of a perfect world scenario for me. Cause I do like Styles' upside. I do. I think he's got size, athleticism, strength, just needs to be coached. That's really what it boils down. And if he can't play tackle, you could slide him inside. I mean, you know what I mean? He's a tough enough kid to play guard. And that's an important part too.
I'm never against taking athletic offensive tackles.
Mm-hmm.
Simple as that. I mean, he's very raw, but watching him move also tells you that he's a kid that's either played soccer or basketball or track, done something because he moves well laterally, at least in my opinion, and does so better than many of the other tackles that we talked about today and on other shows.
And he can bend. That's the thing too. You watch him here, Brian. He's a knee bender, and that's important. That's very important.
He can get down against those guys that try to dip underneath him and get around the corner. He can get down to them, and some guys can't do that.
So those two kids to me would be the top two on my board. If you're asking me, it'd be Gearby and Styles for my board, because I'm someone who covets upside, Brian. Because Gearby Lambert's a pretty raw kid too. He's not a Charles Jagasol type that could be big and strong and powerful enough on day one to play. He's not that. He's more projectable. He's more Mike McGlinchey than he is Ronnie Stanley. Mike McGlinchey needed 2 full years of development before he was ready to play. Ronnie Stanley needed development, but he could do it in a year. He was ready in a year to play. Gearby's going to need to get bigger and stronger and some of those kind of things. And, but the talent, I mean, he's got immense talent. And that's the thing is, like, you're going to need at least one of those guys to be able to come in and by their redshirt freshman year, be ready to play. Ideally, that's the ideal situation. So you asked me what would be my ideal scenario on the offensive line. It's Gearby and Styles Prescott. That's what it would be for me.
I have no disagreement with it. I was just curious if there was a backdoor. Plus, there's always like a late bloomer. O-line is famous for that. So you never know. Could be like, I wasn't talking to you about Joe Alt very early in the process during his senior year because he played tight end.
Right.
I remember his junior year of high school. Nobody did. We think he might be good. That was
well, like I gave him a 4.5-star upside grade, and he's outplayed that. But the thing is, his current grade at the time was 3.5 stars because you're like, I think he could be really good, but he's a 260-pound tight end right now. You don't know. These kids don't have that same need for physical projection, but the tools are there. So that's where we're at the offensive line. The next two positions I want to discuss, Brian, I want to talk about running back and tight end, and we're going to kind of talk about them together because there's some guys on the board, but it's a unique situation for Notre Dame because in all reality, outside of 2 receivers and 1 to 2 offensive linemen, they've met all their other needs on the offensive side of the ball. They don't need a second tight end in this class. They don't need a second running back right now in this class. I think they want a second running back, and I think they're still trying to determine if they're going to take a second tight end right now, to be completely honest with you. And so when I look at it, I see running back as it's a two-man deal right now. It's Kedron Young from Texas and Anthony Carey from Florida. They want those two kids because of how good they are. They're not necessarily needs. And I think it's smart to keep an eye on a second back because it's not out of the line. It's not out of question, Brian, to see both of Notre Dame's top two backs go pro next year. It's not out of question at all to say that they could both end up going pro. And you're going to need that second back then. So I think that's why they're looking at it, but it's still, as of right now, not a need. But they're recruiting Kedron Young and they're recruiting Anthony Carey because they're just really good football players that seem to be, according to the staff, really good fits right now. And I think that's the reason that you're seeing them push for those two kids. And Kedron, I was just DMing with him the other day. He plans on he's going to be on campus for an official in June. He was going to try to get up for in the spring, but just, couldn't work out. But he's going to be up. Anthony Carey is going to be up again for a visit. So that's the running back board right now. If they don't get one of those two guys, in my opinion, barring some breakout year, some kid that's a stud that they can get on that wants to come later, that's the board because it's not a need, it's a want. And those two kids really fit what they're looking for. It's kind of interesting too because Kedron really reminds me a lot of Audric Estime, and Anthony Carey reminds me a lot of Logan Diggs. So it is kind of interesting that 1-2 punch is the way that it is. We're gonna bring up some of their film here while we're talking about them too as well, Brian. So what are your thoughts on these two guys, Brian? I know you've had a chance to watch them both play.
Well, I know Anthony Carey personally, but Kedron Young is one of my favorite players, not only at the running back position, but nationally. And this was before I know Notre Dame had offered, but before I even knew they had any remote chance. I've always been a big fan of the big running back. And he has the hips down to the knees, that area just is sheer muscle, and there's a lot of it. He breaks through tackles that makes me think of like Rodney Culver, makes me think of Julius Jones, different guys that when they laid their pads down, you were making a business decision on whether or not you wanted to make that tackle. And I'm not saying he's Jerome Bettis. There's only one of those. But he is a thumper, and he's got a good first move, too. If a guy breaks into the backfield, Kedron Young can make a miss, and he's 215 at the least. He's probably 220 or more. And
look at that thick lower half, Brian. I mean, that's a powerful kid right there.
And he's, by the way, for people that don't know where he's from, Lufkin, Texas, is East Texas. This is where, like, when the Aggies were good in the late 80s, early 90s, they made a living, etc. You will not get tougher kids than East Texas kids. It is godforsaken, rose fields, ranches dry. There is nothing going on there. Kids trying to get out. If you get kids from there, you're going to get kids who are going to give you their all. So that's a nice little added bonus, too. Notre Dame does not do very well in East Texas. Only a handful, Ronnie Nix, Bobby Taylor, a few others, but by and large, you're going to get thumpers and guys that'll give everything. So
we're still trying to learn more about his family, but what I know so far, especially with his mom, it's you're going to understand why he's looking at Notre Dame the more you get to know his family. It starts to make sense to you.
Is his mom similar to a certain mom that was in the 211 class with a defensive tackle from Georgia? Is she in that line?
Yes. Like a lot of the kids that they've gotten recently, the Benjamin Morrison families, the Braylon James's types that just understand, yes, my son is a great football player, but my son brings a whole lot more value than just a football player, right? And that's the type that you're looking for. Understand that, hey, what if football doesn't work out, right? The parents that get that understand I'm not just raising a running back, I'm raising a young man, right? You get that vibe from them. And again, this is early in us getting to know them and what we've been able to learn about them, but that's something that you get to and you're like, okay, that's the kind of kid that will come to Notre Dame and thrive because he understands there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to it than that. So he's a really talented player, Brian. And you see the power there. But the thing I love about power can be overrated in high school because I think what happens is power causes people to overrate a lot of kids and has a chance to it's like offensive line. Well, why do they miss on certain kids? Well, they miss on kids because they just saw this kid dominating people in high school, and they ignored the fact he doesn't have good feet. He's got tight hips and all this other kind of stuff. You see that at running back as well. You'll see these kids that are just like, you remember the kid out of Virginia went to Michigan a few years ago? He was that way. The running back Green, he just was bigger than everybody else. But you watch a player like this kid's not a very good running back.
He was ranked high by everybody. Whoa.
Yes, but then you watch a kid like Kedron Young, you're like, he's not dominant because he's powerful. He's dominant because he has great feet, great vision, great feel for the game. Oh, and by the way, he also happens to be powerful. And I think that's the thing that I like about him. Here's Anthony Carey, as we're watching him now. He's another kid, Brian, too, that I think for whatever reason, a lot of the Southern schools aren't pushing as hard for him, which I'm not upset about. And you look at his top 6 list, he's got a final group of 6. Notre Dame's not the only Northern school on there, which is a good sign because it tells me that this is a kid that's thinking more big picture than what a lot of Florida kids think, which is, I'm fine leaving the South if it means that I'm going to go somewhere and have a chance to play. Like I know Michigan State, for example, is on his list. He was just recently visited Michigan State. So I think this is another kid that has the talent to say, yeah, we may not need a second back, but I'll take one because this kid can really play.
I know Anthony well, and if there's one thing about him is he's very determined. Anything and everything he does, he goes all out. He could play nickel, he could play safety, he could probably convert to receiver at some point. His primary position is running back. When they play 7-on-7 with him, they put him at middle linebacker, and he covers slots.
Mm-hmm. He's
just a great football player. So he's not as powerful as Young, but he's built completely different. He's a $190 to 185, something like that his junior year. The other day he put up a post. He was 199 and something or other. He's put on about 10 pounds. He's pushing that 200 mark.
When you see the lower body too, he's another kid, Brian, that has that really good size lower body. So he's adding weight up top, getting more kind of grown man strong. But you see that lower body, the feet, and then that the just the size of his lower body. This is a kid that's good. They're both every down backs. And that's the thing is they're both guys that bring a different element to the table than what Aeneas Williams and Jeremiah Love bring to the table. And that's what a backfield's no different than running back or receiver were, Brian. You need guys with you need a little bit of diversity to what you do. You can't just keep. I mean, you can if if you're Alabama and you're just so much better everywhere than everybody else back in the early 2010s. But most teams need, and Georgia's been great with this too. Georgia's got a very diverse, especially their good backfields, have been very diverse. I mean, you think of the 2017 backfield, which is one of the best backfields we've seen in the last decade. Sonny Michel was different than Nick Chubb, and both of those guys were different than DeAndre Swift. You have different skill sets. So what could Georgia do? They could get 2 or 3 of those guys in the field at the same time. I mean, the only long run Georgia had against Notre Dame in 2017 when they played was a jet sweep handoff to DeAndre Swift, not a design handoff to anybody. And I think that's something that you look at too, is that unique skill set. These 2 kids bring a little something to the table different than the younger kids on the roster. Because it doesn't matter they compare to Audric and Logan, because they're not going to play with those guys very long, if at all. I mean, I don't know if these kids are ever going to play with Audric Estime, to be honest with you.
I would doubt it.
Yeah. Maybe Logan for a year, but that's it. Right. And so it's about building a backfield that has different skill sets. And if in a couple of years, your backfield at Notre Dame is Jadarian Price, Jabron Payne, Jeremiah Love, Aeneas Williams, and one of these 2 kids, you have at least 3 different skill sets in that group of 5. And that's really where you want to be.
Anthony Carey can fit in a lot of ways. Your comparison that you did earlier to Diggs holds some water. Diggs was a slightly bigger. He was about 205 at this point instead of 200. But everything else is pretty much spot on. Mm-hmm. So I think Carey's a better player laterally. But they'll both lower the pads. Both of them can catch. So 1st and 10, 3rd and 8. If you can play on both downs as a running back, you present great value to whichever school you play for. Anthony Carey can do that. So that's one of the reasons he's gotten a gazillion offers. A little note, I spoke with Anthony a few weeks ago via message, and he'd put up his top 6 or whatever the heck it was that Notre Dame was in, and there was no Florida school in it, which for a kid that had Florida offers, and he just thought the other schools did a better job of recruiting him. So Notre Dame traditionally does better in the state of Florida when they're not going against Florida State, or Miami. It's just,
And Alabama and Georgia.
yeah, I
Right.
mean, it's like, I
Right.
don't know. If you'd have asked me 2-3 months ago, I'd have said Florida's where he's going to go. They're not even his top 6. So
Yeah.
either I was just way off or something went way off, whatever. But, Notre Dame's in a much better spot than I thought for Anthony Carey.
I have a feeling when you launch your Florida Georgia show, you're going to have a topic one day this summer that's going to evaluate the recruiting being done by Billy Napier and his staff. Because it's a
It
little
is
weird.
weird. Oh man,
That's the only way to describe it, Brian. It's just weird.
Some of the stuff I have I can't air, just
Mhm.
can't. But
Right.
it's stuff that you can't make up.
Right.
It's just utterly ridiculous, and it's not necessarily all Billy. Some of it's the idiot brigade that were involved with Rashada.
Right.
Deep details
Right.
on that, but there are other things too on visits. That school, I've been told, A+ to F-
Yes.
on visits.
Yes.
It is bizarre. If you're Florida, and I've been to that campus numerous times, been to games, all that kind of stuff, it's not very hard.
Yeah.
It is not very hard.
I've been to Gainesville. I've been in the swamp. Yes, you're absolutely right, Brian. That should not be a hard place to recruit to. It
Look,
should
that
not.
is a top 5 college football job, in my opinion.
Yeah. Now their 24 class is off to a pretty good start. I mean,
They
it
got
really
the
is.
they got the Lagaway kid.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
That
they've got 2 really good linebackers in the class already, although I still think Adarius Hayes ends up as an edge. But
he does too.
Right. Now they've been helped in similar ways that Notre Dame's been helped in the past too, that you'd have had to really screw up the Miles Graham recruitment not to get him. You'd had to screw that one up, and I heard they almost did. They still got him, right?
Well, they need linebacker help too, so
Right.
that was important.
Right. So I mean, they're off to a good start. It's just weird. But these are the 2 running backs on the board. Tight end's also interesting, Brian, because they had Jaden Riddell on campus, and Notre Dame is doing really well in his recruitment. Same with Carter Nelson. My thing is, though, at this point in time, Brian, is I don't know if they're set yet to definitely take a second tight end right now. I think because they're looking at their current depth chart and they're saying, like, all the guys we have now are coming back. You're talking about Mitchell Evans still has 2 years of eligibility left. You've got Kevin Bauman, I don't necessarily count as that. You've got Eli Raridan, you've got Holden Stace, you've got Cooper Flanagan, you've already got Jack Larson committed in your class. I think that Notre Dame is always going to be tight end heavy, but I think that they're trying to reevaluate just how many scholarships they want the tight end position to have moving forward. And there's been years where they've had like 6. I think this staff is saying we're good enough at this tight end that we don't need a 6th scholarship tight end, and you've got Davis Sherwood on scholarship.
Yeah.
To where, hey, let's bring an extra receiver in. Let's bring in an extra running back. Let's bring in
get
an
a
extra
dynamic
lineman. Right.
Sure.
And to where, and now you look at like, okay, we love Jaden Riddell. We love Carter Nelson, but is that really the best use of our scholarships? And then the second part of this too, Ryan, is as they're getting into the 25 recruiting as well, they're realizing the 25 tight end class so far seems loaded. And there's a lot of 25 tight ends that are very high on Notre Dame. You've got the Roberts kid from Oklahoma. You've got Ryan G's already made 2 trips to Notre Dame. The James Flanagan, who's the son of Jim Flanagan, Wisconsin, who's a Notre Dame legacy. Doesn't mean that they're going to definitely get him, but they're in the game for that. There's a lot of tight ends that have already been offered in that class. And when you've had the success Notre Dame has had, it doesn't matter where these kids are from. They're looking at Notre Dame because of the position. And I think that's the other thing too is, hey, let's space out our numbers a little bit. We got 2 in the 22 class. We got 1 we really like in 23. We got 1 in 24. And here's the other thing. Flanagan and Larson are 2 completely different type of players, which helps them because it's not like they're missing a skill set because of the last 2 class. They got the blocker, traditional guy in Cooper Flanagan. They've got the sort of the wing, move around slot guy that can also play attached in Jack Larson. They got both of those in the 22 class or the 21 class with Raridan the 22 class with Raridan and Stace. So you look at your 4 moving forward and you got 2 traditional types and 2 guys you can move around, but they can all do a little bit of everything. They feel pretty good about where they are at tight end right now. Plus you've got Davis Sherwood, who's sort of an H-back, fullback type of tight end. So I think I wouldn't be shocked if Notre Dame at some point in time is like, you know what, we like these kids, but we'd rather save that extra spot for a 6th defensive lineman, a 5th DB, a 4th receiver, a second back. Because the reality is they're going to have a tough time getting up to 25 and 26 this year, Brian. That's just with what they have on their roster because of how many kids they brought in the last 2 years. Notre Dame's going to be in a tough spot when it comes to numbers. So you've got to they'd like 2 tight ends, they'd like 2 running backs, they'd like 4 receivers, but you can't bring in all of those numbers at those positions. You have to make a cut somewhere. And I could see tight end being a position where Notre Dame says, we like these kids a lot, but we just feel that this extra scholarship needs to be used somewhere else.
22 to 24, better guess.
20 and right now probably closer to 22, because they want to load up in 25 again. There's gonna right, and
you could say the scholarship for the next class, like you were talking,
exactly.
Because 25 for people who don't know is considered by everybody I know, and us two in particular, to be better than 24. So if you're going to shoot it out, better to shoot it out in the class that has the top end talent.
Right. And that's where they're at. Because if you bring in 2 this year and you look at next year, then now you're talking about having 6 scholarship tight ends. When you get there's going to be 2 years where you're going to have 6 scholarship tight ends if you don't lose somebody. And I don't know if that's necessarily where I think
that's probably hyperbole. Yeah, it's too much. So unless it's a special situation, I would hold the scholarship.
Yeah, agree. So that's kind of where we're at with the offensive recruiting, Brian. I think that right now it comes down to they got 6 guys already. They've got probably the 2 best guys they're going to get in this class are already on board. What are you going to add with it? What are you going to combine to it? I think those are the questions. And somebody did bring up something about tight end actually, what? We're going to start that and talk about that in the mailbag because we are going to have a mailbag next. And so if you have some questions for the mailbag, get those in now. But I think the thing for me, Brian, is it's defense. It's a much bigger question mark. And we'll talk about defense next week. Offensively, they're in a great place. And this current staff inherited a very good situation from the Tommy Rees, his group and Harry Heastand, because you already had Peter Jones, you had Cam Williams, you had CJ Carr, you have Aeneas. So and of course, a lot of that is the current staff. I mean, Jared Parker brought in Jack Larson, Deal McCullough you get what I'm saying? The new look staff is in a great situation because they did inherit CJ Carr and Cam Williams and the group that they have. Now it's about, okay, close it out well. And we're going to find out if they can. And we talked about it. And closing it out is getting me 2 of those receivers and Gearby Lambert. Literally, Brian, if all they get in the rest of this offensive class, if all they land from here until signing day is Gearby Lambert and 2 of those receivers we mentioned, this is a needle-moving, gap-closing offensive class. I mean, that's how – and then anything beyond that is just, okay, that's icing on the cake, right? Give me a second running back. That's just now I'm just being silly. Now I'm just, just piling up the talent. Give me a 4th offensive lineman. Hey, now I'm just adding to beyond what we needed. So I think that's really where it's at. 2 of the receivers and Gearby Lambert. Give me that. This is an outstanding 9 because last year's offensive class was huge. That's the thing people forget. I mean, it was you had a quarterback, running back, 4 receivers, a tight end, and 5 offensive linemen. You had 12 kids you signed last year's class.
You can't do that 2 years in a row.
You need to maybe load up a little bit on some of the defensive positions this year. And so I think that's where they're at. So if they're going to get up to 11 and 12 this year, it's going to be because they've added some dudes on the back end of it. And that's where I think Notre Dame is right now. So I think 9 to 10, top it out at 11 is really where I think they're going to go on offense in this class. So they're actually close. And that's why Notre Dame, Brian, at the end of the day, they have to be smart about taking early commitments. You can't take an early commitment from a kid that's just telling you, I'm going to take visits. You just can't do it anymore.
Nope.
But them loading up early is important because now they've got those dudes in the class. Now they can narrow their focus and have more coaches going after a smaller group of players because that's how you get Kedron Young out of Texas. That's how you get Anthony Carey out of Florida. That's how you get Jason Robinson out of California. We got an interview on Jason now. He's talking to Parker. He's talking to, on top of Stuck, he's talking to Parker. He's talking to Chad. He's talking to Freeman. You got the whole staff going after him. Why? Because Gino doesn't have to recruit a quarterback in 2024, so Gino can help with other positions, right? You look at Chancey Stuckey, he's got to do his thing, but like Jared Parker's got his tight end for this year's class, and they know what their board is for next year. So you're in a situation where once the board gets smaller and you can put more attention on a smaller group of players, that's how Notre Dame's going to be able to close. Now they just need to do it, and that's going to be the key because as we said, Brian, it's an important year. You're off to a great start. The difference between this being a truly gap-closing class or a class that simply just makes you better, and there's a difference, is going to be how they finish.
No argument. It's straight up the way it is. To be honest, they should be able to do that.
Yes.
Lambert, like you, is the only – when you talk about this one player, you never know how one recruitment's going to go.
Yeah.
So that is the wild card. It's just going to have to play out. They could end up in a year or two, maybe they end up getting a transfer or something. You never know. If something happens to one of the other young tackles, gets hurt or something, they might have to. If they don't get Lambert. That's just part of college football. That's where Notre Dame's at, along with everybody else. So you cross that bridge when you get there.
That's right. So that's going to do it for this portion of the show, Brian. We're going to have the mailbag coming up next. Before we do, I want to ask y'all to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. If you have not done so, if you like listening to Lucky Lefty via the podcast app, if you like listening to the CFB All-America team, we've got some more things coming on. Brian is going to have a show here that we're going to launch here over the next couple months at some point in time, where he's going to cover Florida and Georgia recruiting as part of the CFB Nation app as well. Sometimes it'll include Notre Dame top targets, obviously, but more so just covering high school football and high school recruiting in the state of Georgia, or college recruiting in the state of Georgia and Florida, because Brian obviously lives in Florida right now, but he just scours those states. When was the last time I talked to you and you were actually at home, Brian? I can't remember the last time that was.
What today is about
and I'm like, what state are you in? You're in Texas. Oh, okay, sure, great. I'm not sure why, but hey, it's good to hear it. But he's going to have a show on there. You need to subscribe to the CFB Nation app. Over these next couple months, we're going to start transitioning Lucky Lefty, CFB All-America, our recruiting shows, the Rise and Draft. I'm going to have a show that I'm going to launch it on CFB Nation at some point in time that's going to talk about college football as a whole. We're hoping. I met with Sean Davis today. We're going to have shows that cover the Power 5 conferences. We have a couple other ideas on things, but that's all going to be available on the CFB Nation YouTube channel and the CFB Nation podcast. So if you haven't signed up yet for those shows, please do so, because we are going to start transitioning to where you can only find those shows on the CFB Nation platform. So you can find, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcast, the IB podcast, you can also find CFB Nation. So make sure that you have gone there and subscribed to those shows today. So, Brian, it's mailbag time. You and I haven't done a mailbag together in a very long time. We've got 12 stars so far. I want y'all to get some more of those questions in. And I'm going to start down at the bottom, Brian, to kind of continue this tight end conversation that we were having, because there's a couple people talking about this. Sammy J said this: Raritan's injuries are concerned. Not sure how that affects the math. D-Troll Hunter says we have too high of an injury rate at the tight end with a few other guys on the roster. Couple things about that. Those are good, valid points. But Kevin Bauman he's a senior already. You're not equating a senior into the numbers in the 24 and 25 classes. They're already gone. You're recruiting. You're talking about recruiting junior classes and younger. So when you look at the junior class now, does Notre Dame even? Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, you've got Mitchell Evans in that class, right? He still has multiple years of eligibility left. Then you have Eli Raritan. Yes, that's a legitimate knee injury concern. Not going to say it isn't. You have Holden Stace in that class, who has still 3 years of eligibility left. Then you have Cooper Flanagan, who's coming in, and he doesn't really have a legitimate. I mean, he had a late season injury. It's nothing major that most kids don't have. And then, of course, you got Jack Larson. So the only guy with any kind of significant injury history of that group is Eli Raritan. So he's your 4th guy. But the thing is, for me, if 5 is where you ideally want to be, and then because you'll get to 6, Brian, but you're getting to 6 for a year, and then you're getting down because you're going to lose 2 guys off the roster or a guy off the roster that next year, right? Or you lose some kids to transfer, and then you go get a tight end down the road. And I think that's really where Notre Dame is like, if we get to the point where we need a tight end because of injuries, because we've gone through the year and Eli's just not coming back the way we think he's going to come back, you can go get a tight end down the road. That's a guy. Or here's another thought. You don't think there's going to be transfers beating down the door to want to come play tight end at Notre Dame, right? That's the other thing, is there are some opportunities where Notre Dame can get a graduate guy to come in for a year to provide depth at tight end. Because here's the thing, folks, that Notre Dame can sell for NFL, for kids who want to go to the NFL. A couple of years ago, our number 3 tight end, when I say we, I'm talking about from the Notre Dame coach's standpoint, right? Hey, last time we went to the playoff, our number 1 tight end is about to be a first-round draft pick. Our number 2 tight end was a third-round draft pick. And our number 3 tight end, yeah, he went undrafted, but he's currently starting in the NFL for the Detroit Lions. All 3 of our tight ends from the 2020 roster are probably going to be starters in 2023 in the NFL. That's your selling point. You can't sell it any better than that. And so, yeah, you may come here and be a number 2, but guess what? Our number 2 tight ends at Notre Dame are NFL players.
It's amazing.
That's the reality of it.
That's another one of those randoms. I don't know if 3 guys that played at the same time, specifically at tight end.
You have to go back to the Lou Holtz era to do that.
Yeah, I mean,
Oscar, you had like Derek Brown, Irv, because you had 3. You had Oscar, you had Irv Smith, and Derek Brown were all on a roster for like 2 years under Holtz.
Yeah,
and then one year you had, I think it was Irv and Oscar, and I think Pete Kriplevitz was with them for a year when Derek left, and then Pete came for a year. But Brian, it just doesn't happen like that very often. It doesn't, and that's Notre Dame's selling point is. And the undrafted guy last year played better than the guy that got picked in the 3rd round. Talking about Brock Wright. So
that's football.
The point is to address the because Detro Hunter and Sammy J, you guys are bringing up valid points. Like we don't know what Eli Raridon is going to be, but the staff is already kind of planning for that. We can go get a guy later, or that's a position where we know we can go in the portal and get a graduate guy for a year. I'd rather commit to a guy for a year than commit to a guy for 4. That we may end up not having the ideal numbers for. That's
that point right there. I had that conversation with some people this weekend. They didn't like it because they were on the other side. Their kids trying to get recruited and stuff. O-line and quarterback, it's the worst because those 2 spots take the longest to develop historically. And Notre Dame, to your point, look, it's not hard to sell tight end in recruiting, especially to a guy that's on that teeter-totter point. He was a BC. He could be a Dartmouth or Cal. It doesn't matter. You go play 1 year at Notre Dame and put on your resume that you were a tight end. That's not going to hurt your cause.
Right.
It's just not. So I don't know. Has Notre Dame taken a true tight end transfer from grad off the top of my head? I don't think they have they? If they did, it was somebody
not as a starter. I mean, not as. They got I think a walk-on kid.
Yeah. I'm sure. Like if you get any kind of grant and aid and you're trying to get an MBA or something, sure, go to Notre Dame.
Well, and here's the other thing too that people have to understand: Notre Dame doesn't look at Henry Garrity the same way they do most walk-ons. That's the other part of this too. Is Henry Garrity's coming to Notre Dame as a walk-on as part of the 2023 class. This is a kid that if he was not Pat Garrity's son and was not considered a lock to go to Notre Dame, would have a lot more Division I offers, in my opinion. And so
everybody thought that's where he was going. So
exactly. They all knew. They weren't going to waste their time recruiting Henry Garrity when they knew he was going to go to Notre Dame. And so that's the other thing too, Brian, that people have to consider is you got to think about the Henry Garrity aspect of this conversation as well. Because Henry Garrity is a kid that had MAC offers. He had offers from Ivy League schools. And so instead of him being your grad transfer from the Ivy League in 4 years, you just took him now as a walk-on. And so that's the other thing, too, is if you're talking about numbers down the road, Henry Garrity has to be looked at differently than just a typical walk-on, where he's going to be this is a kid that down the road has an opportunity to be a guy that is playing it for Notre Dame at tight end. Now, maybe he doesn't. And if he doesn't, it's because you're great there. But if you get into a position where you need a guy to be your number 2, number 3, Henry Garrity is going to be entering year 2, year 3, year 4. That's going to be a good football player. And you're not committing a scholarship to him. And if he earns a scholarship down the road, then you're committing a scholarship for a shorter period of time than bringing in a 4-year player. So that's the other thing you have to consider is, and here's the other thing too, is let's say you bring in a big name tight end and he's not going to play for a couple years. Okay, so you brought him in and you lost out on numbers somewhere else. Can you promise me that top 50 national recruited tight end is going to stay if he's not playing that much the next couple of years? Know who's not going to leave? Henry Garrity. So those are the things you have to look at and consider when you're talking about putting a roster together. Fans just think it's just load up. Oh, load up and figure it out. I mean, there's something to that, but you can't just do that willy-nilly. You have to have some strategy involved to just load up and figure it out. And I think right now, Notre Dame has been a bit over on tight end numbers. for years. And I think now they're saying, hey, we're going to do a lot of 12 personnel, but we don't need 6 tight ends to do 12 personnel the right way. We can do that with 5 and then maybe bring in an extra receiver, an extra running back, an extra linebacker, an extra D lineman, or an extra DB. And I think that's the other thing too, is I think there's some rethinking of what the roster makeup needs to be. And I think that's a good thing, because the game has changed. You got to look at what your future opponents are. You might look at your next 3 years on the schedule and say, boy, there's a lot of spread teams on our schedule. It would be smart for us to maybe add an extra defensive back on there. One of the things that Mike Gundy talked about, what helped them on defense under Jim Knowles, is they reallocated their numbers. They said they took 2 scholarships away from the offense and gave them to the defense, which allowed them to just every year go out and get more athletes. And next thing you know, they finally get that veteran team, in most spots veteran, that can go out there and play. And so I think that's the thing to consider. And again, I understand the injury concern that people are bringing up. That's a very valid point. I'm just saying there's other ways to rectify that than bringing in a freshman who's you're basically committing 4 years to, or a big time freshman who you may lose it, because then if he comes, Brian, he's not happy, he leaves. You've not only lost him, but you lost out on that extra scholarship that you could have used somewhere.
100%. That's why unless it's just a dude. I know this isn't popular with the people I deal with. I'm taking the transfer. It's just true. It's more surefire, and it's a less long decision, meaning it's 1 or 2 years instead of 4.
Or give me a really good walk-on like a Luke Talich, like a Henry Garrity. Guys that are legitimate FBS players that in time could end up helping. Like, I'm not saying that Henry Garrity is going to eventually develop into Michael Mayer. I'm not saying that. But could I see a scenario where you're running 13 personnel and Henry Garrity's part of your rotation package?
Sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Look at Davis Sherwood last year.
Right.
I didn't know who the hell that guy was.
Right.
He's earned his way, or they wouldn't have put him on the field, and he played all the time.
Right. And he played well. Did you ever watch a game? You're like, man, that Davis Sherwood guy really screwed that play up.
He smacked people in the mouth, bro.
Yeah. Right. Now, and again, he eventually earned a scholarship, and maybe Henry will too, but I'd rather be that than the 2 scenarios that I got to. So that's kind of where I'm at. So the points are valid, folks, about the injuries, very valid. I just think that there's other ways to rectify that if it becomes a problem. And also we have to think about Henry Garrity as part of those numbers as well. So, because if his name isn't Henry Garrity, the odds are, Brian, you'd have had to offer him a scholarship to get him on campus. I mean, you take advantage of that, in my opinion.
Hey, man, you only get so many freebies if you're Notre Dame. They almost always get the short end of the recruiting advantage stick, distance, weather, grades, etc. When you can grab something, make sure you do. This is a good chance to do so.
That's what I love about the staff, Brian, because it may not end up being something that allows them to win a championship or whatever. We'll find that out. But it's so important to have a really quality walk-on program. And Brian Kelly did okay with this. He did. I mean, look, there's been several walk-ons that have helped Notre Dame. But the last couple of years, I really feel like the walk-on game has stepped up. And maybe it's an anomaly. But when you're talking about Jordan Faison, who's down there in Florida, when you're talking about Luke Talich, who turned down offers from Utah and Washington State to come to Notre Dame, when you're talking about Henry Garrity turning down MAC offers, exactly.
Right. Utah's damn good.
Yes.
Right? Absolutely.
You upped your walk-on game in a big way.
The kid from Florida is legit. I watched his film too. He could play. He could play in the AAC. He could play in the Sun Belt. He could play in the Conference USA, no question. And maybe help Notre Dame out down the road. So they've upped their walk-on game in a big way, and that's important, very important. Because we lost this guy at linebacker. It's all right. Luke Talich is there. You're going to be fine. The depth is going to be just fine. And I think Henry Garrity falls into that conversation as well. Got a question here, Brian, that's going to be for you. This is from USMA 87. Is there a Florida recruit that Notre Dame has a better than normal shot to land? Because obviously Florida has not been a very kind state to Notre Dame for a while. This is a multiple-pronged answer, as this person probably knows. And I live here in Florida, have since 2016. This state is, from a football and prospect perspective, as individualized as any in the country tenfold. We don't know why. Even the people that live here, some of the trainers and coaches, that doesn't fit Notre Dame very well, and I'm being uber kind. So with that in mind, the kids they've targeted have been private school kids and just exceptional athletes, guys outside the box. 3 of them are at Carrollwood Day School in Tampa. that I know well. And there could be a couple others possibly, but Solomon Williams, DN, I'll talk about in a second. We talked about Bredell Richardson, Anthony Carey. Any of those three, ironically, again, all the same school, could end up at Notre Dame. Solomon, for people that don't know, I talked to him Saturday. When I talked to him, he'd just gotten a text message from a guy by the name of Marcus Freeman. So they are definitely recruiting him. He's an edge defender, 6'3", 250 kid. That his recruitment went bananas in January. He told me that he goes, I'd like to visit Notre Dame. I have so many visits lined up. I have to stay home at least one weekend this spring, so his mom doesn't kill him. But he might visit this summer. They could get any of those kids, but to be honest, I don't know if it's all that necessary. I can't believe I'm saying this. They've done well enough, and this goes back to your point about the whole 247 debate, nationally, and just cherry picking, and this is hard to do. They get like one kid out of this state, one kid out of this, two out of this, and then it works out. If you tell most programs that they will go multiple years in a row without getting a kid out of Florida, it's probably not gone well.
You're not going to be a title contender without that, right? Yeah.
Put it like this. Pittsburgh, when I was growing up and watching Notre Dame in the mid to late 80s, was damn good. The first game that Tony Rice got into and played a lot was against Pittsburgh, and they got
87. Yeah.
I think that was the game that Hayward just dismantled Notre Dame's front, but like he did everybody's. But they didn't have to recruit Florida. This past year, Pittsburgh signed 7. That's how much talent is there. It's insane. So, number one, those are the kids I think it can be, but it's okay if it doesn't work out because, like you've said over and over, and you've argued with different people, it is what it is. Notre Dame can go long stretches without hitting Texas or California, whatever. They're one of about, what do you say, Brian, 5 to 7 schools that are kind of like that and get away with it. And again, this is a culture issue more than anything else, especially the public schools down here. The kids want upfront NIL money, period. Upfront, stick it in your nose. If you don't like it, we out. And it's a lot of it's the handlers and the people around.
Yeah.
As slimy as it gets. Oftentimes the kids aren't even the ones. It's grotesque. I have stories.
That's part of it, Brian. And you're spot on about NIL, but the reality is this has been going on longer than NIL has been a thing. There's other factors.
100%.
Well, number one
100%.
being the education is not stressed as much in Florida as it is in other areas. And number 3, and this is a legitimate thing, if you're a kid in the Southeast, I don't need to leave the Southeast to play for a title contender and go to the NFL. Texas doesn't have that same draw right now. It just doesn't.
That's
California doesn't have that same draw right now.
Yep.
And so that's where, look, Notre Dame has to find areas where they can get that kind of athlete. They can't just ignore the type of athletes you get in Florida. The point that I've made is if you do it right, there's other parts of the country you can hit to find those guys. And that's been my point. And you can't miss those guys in your backyard. Like you can't miss Caleb Brown's. Well, this staff's not missing Caleb Brown. This staff isn't missing on AJ Henning. This staff isn't missing on those northern athletes that they've lost out in the past. That's important. Now, some you're going to miss out on because you can't get him into school. Mylan Graham from Fort Wayne. There's a reason Notre Dame just stopped recruiting him last summer because it's just not going to happen, right? But you can go to Texas and get those top players. You can go to California and get a Jason Robinson. And, talk about Texas. You can go to Texas and get Braylon James and Caleb Smith and Jaden Greathouse and get Rico out of Florida. Out of California. You can get Jason Robinson and maybe out of California. You get Cam out of Chicago. Find that sleeper somewhere else and say all of a sudden you're like, wow, you got a pretty darn good recruiting class. You can get a Jeremiah Love out of Missouri. The reason that they've been able to survive without getting Florida in the last couple of classes is because they're doing the work to find those athletes in other places. Jeremiah Love is a type of athlete you normally get out of Florida. You happen to get him out of a private school in St. Louis. Take advantage. Right? Braylon James is normally the kind of athlete that's going to be in a Texas, a California, or a Florida only. You're not going to find a lot of Braylon Jameses in Virginia, in Jersey, in Pennsylvania. Texas is a place that is right now, and Brian, you've lived there for a little bit. It's a far more conducive to leaving the state. There's not as many schools around there that are big time football, and it's also there's a lot more Braylon Jameses in Texas than it's just sadly. There's a lot more Kedron Youngs and Braylon Jameses in Texas than there is in Florida, where it's the support system is pro Notre Dame.
Very much so.
And or in the case of some, they're more open to encouraging kids to leave and get out of the state. In Florida, there's a heavy push to stay around from families, from coaches, and all over the place. And so, I mean, Brian, you're not going to find a more Notre Dame elite kid than Keon Keeley. You're just not. I mean, everything about Keon Keeley is that's a Notre Dame kid, and couldn't get him. If you can't get Keon Keeley, you're just not going to get many kids from Florida. So you have to really
100%.
think, how much are we going to really invest in this state? Find your Anthony Carries, find your Bredell Richardsons, find those kids. But other than and do it at certain positions. Just know you really shouldn't waste your time recruiting a defensive lineman in Florida unless he's just a unique, different kid. But even then, I'd say Keon Keeley, private school kid, great 3.4 GPA plus type of kid, checks all the pro Notre Dame boxes. As soon as he became a 5-star, it's over. I literally had someone in his camp tell me, well, he's a 5-star now. Like, that supposedly changes something, but it does. You know what I mean? And so if you can't get Keon Keeley, you're just, what are we doing down here? And I think Notre Dame has been smart about that. They are recruiting kids in Florida, but they're not banking on Florida.
That's the best way to put it. If you get a kid from Florida later, and I've talked to Bredell and some of these guys about it, like timeline is everything for all the schools. But I told them, especially for the schools that are recruiting like Michigan, Notre Dame, Penn State, they're going to want to know a little earlier because all these schools, it's the same deal. They get the rug pulled out from under them a lot of times in November and especially December. It's not just Notre Dame. I said, if you want to make a decision early, that's cool, but you also need to shut it down all the way. And I said, completely. None of the Florida kids want to hear that. And that's where Notre Dame is a little funky too, because, once you commit, you're not allowed to take official visits. You're not going to tell a Florida kid not to take official visits.
And it's even more reason why Notre Dame has to take that stance, because you have to find out how committed are you to what we're trying to do.
If they want to take one of those kids, and again, I know these guys
anyway. At least now, like with Keon, they knew right away. Okay, we've put the ultimatum down, and he's still taking visits. The reality is, we're going to lose him anyway.
Yep.
So
I remember that whole deal and talking to him like the day of and all that. Yeah.
Right.
I told Bredell and those guys, I said, if you're going to take visits to Notre schools, do it in October.
Right.
Do it to like Ohio State or Michigan State or whatever. Like Bredell likes Notre Dame and Michigan a lot.
Right.
Visit later. So we'll see what they do.
Again, it's not ignoring Florida. It's just you got to be smart.
Very selective. And again, I live here.
Right.
I know these kids personally.
Brian, the Carolinas has been built up so much now that you're going to have a lot.
North Carolina needs to be their new hub.
Texas is a different animal now, and recruit there. And Chicago's on the uptick. I mean, you can literally and you're going to have 2 years in a row that if you can land Taylor, that you're going to get a legit top 50 borderline 5-star receiver from an hour and a half away. That just doesn't happen at Notre Dame very often. And both very good students. That's the other thing is Taylor's not like some of the kids, because that's the other problem is where you do get elite athletes, Indianapolis and Fort Wayne, Brian, unfortunately, are just you can't always guarantee that they're going to be able to get into Notre Dame.
Mediocre academically. Athleticism is there.
And I've recruited both of those areas. You know this when I was at Defiance. You're an Indiana native. It's unfortunate but true. The schools that tend to be better academic schools just don't. They produce more guys that I'd be recruiting at Defiance and Manchester and Rose-Hulmans and Indiana State and the Valpos, as opposed to being the Notre Dame type of kid. This is just the way it's gone, right? 2 best kids in Fort Wayne this year, Bronte Johnson and Mylan Graham. Notre Dame's offered both of them. The odds of getting either one of them into school is not great. I'm hoping they can still get Bronte, but it's going to be tough. Mylan, no chance. And so that's why you've got to go. But that's the thing that's different about Chicago is these kids are not just great athletes, but Cam Williams is a very good student. Taylor's a very good student. Nathaniel Marshall, very good student. You've got to get those kids. So that's something that helps too, is because I don't need to go to Florida to get a Taylor type because I got him in my backyard. I don't need to go to Florida to get a Cam Williams type. I got him in my backyard.
Well, I watched, for whatever reason, the Notre Dame Michigan State game from '93 last night. I watched
that last week.
and they're going through the lineups. And I know the players by jersey and stuff, but it dawned on me, they kind of going through their defensive front was 3 Illinois kids and a kid from Wisconsin. So,
Chicago kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just not realistic in the last 25 years. For whatever the reason, and I call it the Michael Jordan effect, most of the best athletes really wanted to go to play basketball. Sorry to inform those 6'2", 250-pound guys, they were not going to play in the NBA, but that city for its population was nowhere near what it should have been in the last 20, and it killed Notre Dame. It hurt Michigan and Michigan State to a certain degree too, because they've always relied on the city of Chicago too. And I think it's one of the reasons that it helped Ohio State. It didn't impact their state at all. And they always just cherry pick Chicago every once in a while. So it would do Notre Dame good if they could count on a solid 3 players a year. Back to this question about Florida. If you can get 3 players a year, especially most of them early, which you probably would. Justin Scott's situation is very unusual because he plays a unique position, and he's massive. Not many guys are going to get recruited by Georgia from Chicago. Once every 5 years, there'll be a player. Once every 3 at the most.
Or Brian, if they do, because I think you're going to see more kids get recruited by Georgia. The point is, if they do get on those kids, it's going to be later.
Yeah, like they jumped on him really early.
Right.
Scott's, again, Georgia values D-line probably as much, if not more, than any other school, specifically because they run a 2-gap scheme. There's just only so many guys that can run it, and Scott can run any scheme. And then he also was a good student and all that. If you're going to take a chance on a kid, you want somebody that if he's coming to your area, he's going to adapt. Justin could play at UCLA, he could play at Miami. It wouldn't make any difference. Wherever, he'd be okay. So, but again, ideally, you would like to get 3 kids from the greater Illinois area. If a kid's just across the border in Milwaukee or something, I guess you could count that. But they just haven't been able to do that. There's been years where Notre Dame signed like 1 kid from Illinois in the last 10 years. When Lou Holtz started, I mean, that was unthinkable. It was just a matter of when they were getting a kid from Illinois to commit, and it was probably going to be one of their first 5 commitments. And it was probably going to be a kid that had an offer from schools like Iowa, Michigan, Ohio State that had good players too. So it's amazing how much that city was up, then has been down for a while, and now, like you said, has started to go back on the rise.
It's good for Notre Dame that it's back on the rise.
You're damn right it is.
It's very good for Notre Dame. I'm looking at this, Brian, because you brought up that 93 game, and we're talking about Florida and where to recruit, and I think that was a perfect example. I mean, what we're talking about is a perfect example because when you look at that 93 team, look where a lot of the guys were from. Your offensive lineman was like 2 from Pennsylvania, 2 from California, and 1 from Washington, right? National guys, no Southern guys. You look at your running back Lee Beckton was a North Carolina guy. You look at Ray Zellers, Pittsburgh. But you were still able to have a little bit of an influence from Florida because where's Kevin McDougal from? He was a Florida kid.
Played at Blanche Ely.
Right.
Yep,
so you're able to do that. And then Clint Johnson was from Florida. He was another one.
Yep.
So you're going to get some guys like that. But Lake Dawson, where was Lake Dawson from? He's from Washington.
Yep.
Right? I mean, you can go find those guys, which they just landed a kid from Washington at wide receiver. So, and then you talk about the front 7, and not only on that, but also your starting middle linebacker on that team was a Chicago guy, and Pete Bursich. So you can find those guys. There's no doubt you can find those guys. Bobby Taylor, was Bobby from Texas? He
is an East Texas guy. He is from Longview.
Right. So
he was the number 1 player at his position, period. Every school in the country offered Bobby.
So that's kind of where Jeff Burris was from South Carolina. So the Carolinas to me are more important to Notre Dame to have to get into than is Florida. Doesn't mean you don't recruit Florida. And if I can get a Brito Richardson or an Anthony Carey, great. Do it. So you don't ignore it. You just can't assume you're going to have success there. And that's the thing is, until you win a title. And somebody made a comment down here. Mike Sullivan said this, Brian. He said, Notre Dame is 2 natties away from recruiting Florida. Yeah, I mean, at least one. Yeah, I think at least one. To be able to maybe close to close the deal. But I think it's even beyond that. You got to start putting some kids into the first 2 rounds of the draft.
And
that's
you need
the reality
to do it.
of it.
Here's a little stat for people out there wondering about Florida. It was a 21 or 22 class. I was just goofing around looking at like 247's top 100 in Florida. This was asinine. Out of the top 25 kids, like 22 were defensive players. It's just, we are the ultimate athlete, find ball, kill ball state. If you want somebody that can run like a gazelle, how many do you want?
Right.
That's what we have. It's insane. So Notre Dame, sure, they need more of them, but they also need them to be with 3.2 GPAs and up. That's
or at least, well, they can get guys with lower GPAs, but they have to. The problem is, Brian, is they have to be kids that value that.
Yeah, you can't just be giving it. And a lot of the schools in this state, I know flat out.
Because Keon's a 3.4 GPA, 3.4 plus.
And he did it at Berkeley Prep.
Correct.
Which is an elite.
The difference is, and this, like, I was speaking at a thing a few weeks ago. It was a Newt Rockney function, and they were talking about NIL, and it was Pete Sampson and I were on the panel, and Pete Byrne who's from one of the TV channels, and people, NIL, you lost Keon Keeley because NIL, and I said to him, look, Notre Dame didn't lose Keon Keeley because of NIL. If NIL was the only reason Keon Keeley I still think Keon ends up ultimately going to Notre Dame. I do. They lost Keon Keeley, in my opinion, primarily, and from talking to various sources, because it was a combination of factors, but it really centered around the fact of Keon wants to be a top 10 NFL draft pick as an edge player, and one school has not produced a first-round defensive end since 1998, and the other one produces first and second-round picks every year. That's the difference, right? And so if you're Keon Keeley, and I'm my chosen major for what I want to do vocationally is football, right? If Keon Keeley wanted to be a business major and he chose Alabama over Notre Dame, that's a poor decision. If that's your desired profession, that's a poor decision. If your goal is to be a top 10 NFL draft pick as a defensive end, with all due respect to Notre Dame, they are the Notre Dame business school of football. And we have to come to grips with that as fans. And not just the boogeyman of NILs, the excuse we use for every kid that they don't get. And sometimes it's very valid. But in my opinion, if NIL was the only thing that Notre Dame had different than Alabama, I think Keon's at Notre Dame. I truly believe that. I'm not saying NIL wasn't a factor, but Notre Dame could have been able to swat NIL eventually if they could show him, hey, we're on the same page with Bama in every other way. I think they would eventually won that battle, because Keon's not your typical short-sighted, I only care about getting this upfront dough now. I don't think he cared about it as much as maybe some others around him did. And that's the thing. So to Mike's point, there's a level of success Notre Dame has to achieve on the field before they're going to be able to go down to Florida and consistently recruit that state. Doesn't mean they ignore it, but that's just the reality of it. It's just the reality of it.
Yeah, you cherry pick Florida. They're the icing, they're the cherry on top or whatever. It can't be your priority. So
good discussion there.
This ties into one of the other questions I saw. I don't know what you had next, but the one about the next area that's the sleeping giant. I'm curious to see what you say. The Carolina is my second pick.
We're going to get into that in a second, Brian. We did have
fun on that.
We're going to stay in Florida just for the super chat question. This one right here is from Frank G. Frank says, just got in. Thank you for the super chat, Frank, very, very much. He goes, speaking of Florida, how do we feel about Jamie French in terms of the recruitment and the town? I'll say this about the town. The town's very good. Very good.
There's no problems down here in that.
None. Brian, I'll let you speak to the recruitment, because I think you and I both see this the same way. He's exactly what we were just talking about, in my opinion.
Jamie's a kid that I've known since he was 14, and I remember walking up, and I didn't know who he was. Saw him on a field, and I saw him catch a few passes, and the way he moved. He's the bigger kid. He's the faster kid. He's the twitchier kid. He's got the better hands across the board. And I'm like, who the hell is that? And I thought he's like a junior or something. He said, he's going to be in ninth grade. I'm like, excuse me? So the talent we all knew, and I know one of his trainers real well. He visited Notre Dame. He likes Notre Dame, but it's going to be really hard to beat out local schools. Mm-hmm. Single mom deal. I could see him at Georgia, Florida State. I know that one of his buddy just committed to Florida State, the quarterback. That's tough. If I had to guess, he'll go to Florida State.
They had a much better chance of getting John Mitchell from his high school than Jamie French, and John Mitchell just picked Penn State.
That one was very disappointing.
Yeah.
That was very disappointing.
Yeah. So again, work to be done in the state of Florida.
I mean, you could still win that, but you need something to go really right, like Brian mentioned earlier, with this season at wide. Like somebody has to go out and be a dude. You need to have a reason.
Or like 4 dudes catch a ton of balls.
Yeah. If you catch 4 different guys catch 45 passes,
something has to stand out,
yeah,
right? Because here's the thing, Notre Dame doesn't have to do it a lot. I truly believe, Brian, if they just go out and play for a title this year or win a title this year, I've said, look, I'll say this: Notre Dame winning a title is like anyone else winning 2. And that's just the reality of it. It just is, because this is an area where the perception of Notre Dame helps them if they win, because we hear all the time how hard it is to win at Notre Dame. It's so hard to win at Notre Dame. So if you're able to win one, it's almost like, wow, holy moly, like, you know what I mean? And so it opens up doors. It's not a coincidence that Notre Dame signed one of the best recruiting classes in history a year after they win a national championship or after they win a national championship and then go 12-1 and, win the Orange Bowl and beat the number 1 team. And I think they beat over the course of 2 years, like 13 ranked teams, 88 and 89. And all of a sudden, guess what? They're going all over the country to land one of the greatest recruiting classes ever. And you got like literally 3 Hall of Famers in that. 1 college Hall of Famer in Aaron Taylor, who I think would have been an NFL Hall of Famer if not for the injuries.
Yep.
Because he was off to a great start with the Packers. And then 2 other Hall of Famers in Bryant Young and Jerome Bettis in one class. And that's just, Brian, that's just like part of it. Let me go through it. And you and I have had some fun with this before. We've talked about
5 number 1 picks out of that 90 class.
Let me tell you who. So that would be, let's see here. That would be so this is who was in that class. Okay. Pete Bursich, NFL. I'm just going alphabetical order. Pete Bursich, drafted, NFL. Jerome Bettis, Hall of Famer. Jeff Burris, first-round draft pick. Tom Carter, first-round draft pick. Willie Clark, I think he played in the NFL, correct?
He played for the Chargers. He played corner after playing running back his senior year at Notre Dame.
Yep. John Covington played in the NFL.
In Florida.
Yep. Lake Dawson, drafted, played in the NFL. Jim Flanagan, drafted, played in the NFL. Oliver Gibson played in the NFL.
Steelers.
These are all. Brian Hamilton was a starter on that 93 team. I don't think he was drafted, but he was a very. Clint Johnson was on in that 1990 class. Greg Lane, who in other years would have played even more. He played for Notre Dame, would have played even more if it wasn't so loaded. Dean Little, who Notre Dame players from that era will tell you was the best athlete in that class. He just injuries.
Couldn't figure out a position.
Exactly. But a freaky athlete, Brian, 6'3", 220, just an insane, that played running back. Just an insane athlete. Oscar McBride, NFL player, undrafted but NFL player from Florida. Kevin McDougal was in that class. Mike McGlynn was in that class. I think he started at Notre Dame at times. Anthony Peterson was in that class. Tim Ruddy was in that class. Second round draft pick, played a long time in the NFL. LaShane Sadler was in that class. Aaron Taylor, Hall of Famer, was in that college football Hall of Famer, was in that class. And Bryant Young was in that class. That was Notre Dame's 1990 class. And it's not, you remember this, Brian? The old BGIs from back in the day?
Yep, I had that.
Yes, sir. That class doesn't happen if Notre Dame is not the Clemson to Miami, like Clemson was to Alabama, they were to Miami back then. I've made this
100%.
From 1987 to 1992, I think it was 87, 88, 89, 90, 91. From 87 to 91, Miami won 3 titles. The 2 years they did not win a title, I believe they finished second. And in both years, they lost to Notre Dame. So
Miami was a machine.
Notre Dame and Miami back then were Alabama and Clemson from 2015 to 2020, basically is what they were. And why? Because they had that on-field success, which then led to the elite recruiting next, right? And so that's what's needed in those areas. And that's what's needed everywhere, but it's especially needed in Georgia and Florida. Because let's be honest, if you're an elite player in Georgia, why would you not go to Georgia if they wanted you? Especially if you're a defensive, I can understand if you're a receiver or an offensive lineman or tight end. I get that.
If you're a linebacker or something.
Well, yeah, D lineman, Like DB, like why would you not go there right now? And forget NIL. It's just I want to be an NFL player and win a championship. So why would I not go there?
The head coach of the Bucks, his son just signed with Georgia. He's a linebacker. He had an offer from every freaking school in the country for Wolves.
We'll go to that question you were mentioning earlier. This is from Joe Medina. He says, what's an area of the country that both of you respectively see as a sleeping giant when it comes to recruiting? Well, Brian, you kind of mentioned it. It's the East Coast. It's like the Mid-Atlantic region to me. It's not one state. I like what he said. It's an area of the country, not a state, because sometimes we focus too much on states. It's more about a region. And to me, if Notre Dame is going to be a juggernaut again, they're going to have to recruit Texas effectively. Now, they're not often going to get like 3-4 kids a year from Texas, but just get 1 or 2 a year. Get 1 or 2 kids from California, West Coast a year. If you can steal a kid or 2 from Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, right? That trio of schools. And they got one. They got a kid from Louisiana last year. And then, you've got to crush St. Louis and Chicago. And then from New Jersey on down to South Carolina, really North Carolina. But if you can find a kid from South Carolina, great. But North Carolina, really, to me, from Jersey, so that's Jersey, Maryland, D.C., Virginia, North Carolina, have to be states where Notre Dame starts having a greater impact. Have to.
The only other state that I would add to this, and this is if you're going to pick one state, and it's because its population has exploded with the tax rate and all that in California, is Arizona. That state's talent is just by accident has went through the roof.
Because you're actually getting some people from Texas as well going to Arizona
100%.
Because not that Texas is a state that people don't live in, but if you're in West Texas and there's certain job opportunities that may not be in West Texas that are available in Arizona. We've talked about Arizona on this show as well. I put them in that West Coast category, Brian. So it's like Arizona, Cali, Oregon, Washington. Got to get a couple kids out of that a year, in my opinion. It used to just be Cali. Now it's like, I don't care if it's Cali or not. Benjamin Morrison 20 years ago is from California, right? That's just the reality of it.
That city of Phoenix, they've had kids every year for the last 25 years that Notre Dame's at least attempted to get. They've had very little success, but maybe Morrison. Morrison's going to be a first-round pick after the 2024 season.
Barring injury, yes.
And that's only going to help you in LA all the way down to Phoenix. So I think they'll at least get visits every year. The defensive end, his name escapes me, but I know they're
Elijah Rushing.
Yeah. Whoever that kid is every year, as long as he takes a visit to Notre Dame, I won't say that. So.
Well, because you've gotten 2 kids from there recently, right? You got Tosh Baker in part of the 2020 class. You got Benjamin Morrison.
Cole Luke back in the day.
Cole Luke in the 2013 class was a very good player at Notre Dame. And I think that they're in a great position for a kid in this year's class, Kennedy Urlacher, who I
forgot all about
very
him.
high on Kennedy Urlacher.
Forgot about him.
Yeah. So there's a receiver in 2025 that they've recruited, that they've offered, that I like a lot. The Cooper Perry kid, who's from a private school out there. That's the other thing too, is there's some really good schools out in that area too. Brophy Prep is a great school.
There's a lot of Catholic money in Phoenix, Brophy being one. There's some others, Notre Dame. There's the different schools that fit that. So it's a little easier for Notre Dame there than say where I live in Central Florida.
Yeah. And so if you can, and here's the thing, there's no one area that Notre Dame is going to make their base where they're going to be able to build up their roster the way that the Southern schools can. I've talked about this. And the only school in the North that really has that advantage is Ohio State. Penn State to a degree, because Pennsylvania's back on is rising. Pennsylvania, Jersey is rising again, which helps Penn State a lot. But to me, it's like I pointed this out, Brian. I think it was like 75, 80%. I did a thing a couple years ago where I was studying Clemson's roster. I think it was in the 2018 roster, maybe. Might have been 2016, but one of those really good Clemson teams. I think it was like 75 to 80, 85% of their roster was from either border states or states that border a border state of them.
They recruit within 400 miles of where their campus is, and that's the end. And they
can fill up the majority of their roster with that. Notre Dame can't do that. They have to be a national program. But the reason that I've always said that Notre Dame can win, even though it's harder, never said it's not harder, is because they can recruit nationally. They just have to be smarter about it. And there are some things happening in the country that are helping Notre Dame. Chicago's back on the ascent. St. Louis is starting to produce more and more of those type of athletes. Where last year you got Christian Gray and Jeremiah Love are Florida caliber athletes that you happen to get from private schools in St. Louis. You're going to do well there. You get Aeneas Williams from Missouri coming up. The West Coast, the Jason Robinsons, the Tobias Merriweathers, the Benjamin Morrisons from Arizona. There are places, and then last year in Texas, if you can make Texas a state where you can get a kid or two a year, you have to do it. You have to do it because that's how they, and then of course the East Coast. You got the one area where they're not having more success that they need to have more success is the Maryland, DC private school area.
I was waiting for you to say that.
Yeah.
I don't get that, but
if there's one centralized area where they have to do better, that's it. But just regionally, I put that area plus Virginia, North Carolina, because look, they've gotten a couple kids from that area and most of them have been pretty good, right? I mean, DJ Brown's been a good rotation player, but Sam Mustipher was a multi-year starter and he's an NFL starter for the Bears, I think, for a couple of years, right? He's from that area. Cam Hart, as long as his injuries don't prove problematic when it comes to NFL teams looking at the medicals, he's, to me, at worst, a day 2 draft pick next year. The way he's progressing as a player, he's from one of those private schools. So, but that's the thing, Brian, is put a Cam Hart in the NFL and see what happens. That's how you're going to have success. Let a Cam Hart be a 3-year starter and a second-round NFL draft pick. And all of a sudden you're like, hey, look, you can come here and do that well because you're losing to Bama, you're losing to Ohio State, you're losing to Michigan, you're losing to Penn State. You got to start winning some of those battles, man. And that's a bit because that's where you're seeing like legitimate top 50 players coming out of. And that's an area you should be having more success with. And they're just not.
Here's the other thing. Out of all the areas that we've talked about today, almost every one of those states that city or region is in, other than Arizona, has a dominant in-state team. Even North Carolina, from a perception standpoint, is a pain in the butt to recruit against, and Charlotte and stuff. For some of those kids, it's a big deal to be a Tar Heel. Maryland ain't very good at football. They're just not. Penn State is more state U there, which is goofy than anybody else. And Virginia Tech is down. Virginia's not good. Notre Dame needs minimum 2 or 3 kids a year to take official visits that they covet from the state of Maryland. Now, that might happen this year. We're waiting to see. There's a certain D lineman that's about 6'6.5" or whatever that I'd love Notre Dame to get. But they've got everything, though.
And they've made a bunch of trips there. They've had Freeman's been down there. Golden's been down there. They've been down there. They just got to get some of those kids. Because to your point, this is why that region as a whole is important, Brian. Jersey, no powerful in-state school. Maryland, D.C., no powerful in-state school. Virginia, no powerful in-state school. And North Carolina, no powerful in-state school. Now, there's good in-state schools in North Carolina. Don't get me wrong, but let's be real. Right now, if a kid wants to be an NFL player and Notre Dame's really on him and recruiting him right, Notre Dame's the better sell for him than whereas in Georgia, they've got Georgia to worry about and Alabama to worry about. And, where in the Carolinas, it's not that. It's Clemson's the closest one, and they're a state down. Right. And so you're competing with Clemson there, but there's no in-state power. And even when Virginia Tech was rolling, if Notre Dame really wanted a kid from Virginia, they got him over Virginia Tech. I mean, they went and got, they could have got Thomas Jones, but they blew it. Right. They got Julius. They got Chris Tyree. They got CJ Pro. If they wanted a kid from Virginia, they could get him more often than not, even when Virginia Tech was good. Because Virginia Tech at their peak is still not Notre Dame from a prestige standpoint. They're still a regional school. And that's another reason, to your point, Brian, why it's important that they have success in that state. Because Arizona's that way. With all due respect to Arizona and Arizona State, they're never going to be Texas. They're never going to be USC. They're never going to be Notre Dame. They're just not. So you should be able to have a little bit more success from there. And it's important to go to those states. And that's a reason why, look, his film's really good. But I just think another reason I really want Kennedy Urlacher, I don't give a rip what his last name is. It's the film is impressive, and he's from Arizona. I just want another Arizona kid on the roster. Because you know this, Brian, the more kids you have from that region, when other kids visit.
They look at that big time.
Yeah.
The Florida kids really do. That's
well, a lot of kids are that way. Texas kids are that way. I mean, there's a lot of kids that are that way. Sure. Because here's the thing. This has always been true. I don't care how much the world has been opened up by technology. We're still by nature tribal as people. You're going to relate to people that have something in common with you. And we have a lot of factors as a country that we point to that. But tribalism ultimately, at the end of the day, primarily comes down to region, where you're from. And you're just going to be, because you have more in common with people from your region than you are from people across the country that may be the same skin color as you or same ethnic background or whatever the case may be. You're still going to have more in common with people that are from where you're from. You're going to share more cultural values, more history, more different things that you can relate to, more food likes. Like when I was at Methodist my freshman year, we had a ton of kids from Florida from there. They all listen to the same music. They all talk about the same. Man, I wish we had a Publix or whatever here. You know, I'm like, dude, a grocery store is a grocery store. But to them, it's like Publix is just, that's home. It's just, you relate to that.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the thing is the more kids that are from where you're from, the more comfortable you're going to be. And so, yes, you give me more kids from that region and I'm going to feel a lot better about it. So Arizona is another one, Ryan. But I put them in that West Coast.
Sure. That
West Coast thing is where I see them kind of from. So I definitely regions that I think Notre Dame needs to have a lot of success. Let's get to some more questions here, Brian. We have Connor Nepper. Thank you, Connor. Says, "Go Irish." Who are some of the other top recruits that CJ will try and recruit to Notre Dame? Well, I mean, you're already seeing it. The guys we broke down today are guys that CJ's been going after. I mean, Jason Robinson, you see him and Jason Robinson having a lot of online conversations now. Him and Jaden Riddell have been teammates on the 7-on-7 team. But CJ was very instrumental in getting Cam Williams. I mean, I'll say this: if CJ Williams is not, or CJ Carr is not leaning to Notre Dame and doesn't commit to Notre Dame soon after Irish invasion, I don't know if Cam Williams would have gone to Notre Dame. Jack Larson said this before. I commend Notre Dame because CJ was there. I still think they would eventually got Jack Larson, but I think having CJ made it easier to get Cam Williams. Maybe they still get Cam Williams, but it just made it easier.
That's why quarterback recruiting is so vital.
Yeah, it is. It is. So my last one is Gearby Lambert. He's done some stuff with Gearby. That's the last guy that I want to see.
I was going to ask you about the guy. If you're a quarterback, that left tackle spots are rather personal.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
For me, it'd be number one, but that's just my perspective.
No doubt. Michael Johnson asks, who is the last South Bend area high school football player to have a big contribution on the Notre Dame football team since Anthony Johnson? It'd be Braxton Cave from Mishawaka. South Bend area is South Bend, Mishawaka, Granger. Paul Mawala was a very impactful special teams guy when he was healthy, but the last guy that was like a starter that I can remember that was a starter and impact player was Braxton on the offensive line. I can't think of anybody else that was a South Bend area guy. We've had Fort Wayne, Jalen, Drew Tranquil, guys like that, but that's South Bend. I'd say Braxton Cave, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
that area just does not produce a lot of players with grades. It just does not.
No, like David Perkins came into Notre Dame. There was no way they're getting David Perkins in the school. No way. That was a waste of a recruitment, in my opinion. So yeah, it just doesn't produce a lot of. There's been a couple basketball players come along, Demetrius Jackson, and then obviously Marcus Burton, who's committed to them in the 24 class, who's from Penn, which is the school district that I live in. Basketball, there's been some guys, but football, it's not a great football there. And like the preeminent program in the area is Penn. They still produce a lot of college football players, period. This is a really good high school program that when they get too deep into the tournament, they get whooped because you don't have the same kind of talent that they have at some other places. So
facts.
All right. Archer 452 asks, offense currently has 6 commitments, 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 2 receivers, 2 OLs, and there's a tight end in there. So Jack Larson's not a receiver. It's 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 1 receiver, 1 tight end, 2 offensive linemen. What numbers will they finish with in each position group? We kind of talked about this earlier, Brian. I'm thinking minimum 9. I think they'd like to have at least 1 quarterback, at least 1 running back, 3 receivers, 3 offensive linemen. And then I think you're going to add 1 or 2 more guys, maybe a tight end, a running. So if you give me 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 3 receivers, 1 tight end, 3 offensive linemen, that gives you 9. I think they might add 1 to 2 more, either a second running back, a second tight end, or a 4th offensive lineman. I could see a scenario where they add a 4th receiver, but it'd have to be a dude down the road. And I think if they get 3, they're going to say, okay, let's really focus on 25. Let's focus our attention on getting Taylor and getting some of those 2025 guys that they like a lot. I think is where you're going to see them shift their focus at that point in time. So good question. Here's an interesting one, Brian, from Archer 452. Said 5 of the current top 10 2024 recruiting classes on the 24/7 composite are schools north of the Mason-Dixon line. How many titles in the next decade will be from schools not in the SEC and ACC? That is a very interesting question because I believe the 5 are Notre Dame, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and I'm not sure who the 5th one would be. Who would the 5th?
Wisconsin,
Wisconsin?
probably.
Okay.
Because they started off pretty hot. That's my
Yeah.
guess.
Well, and that's the thing overall with this is you're going to see a couple of those probably drop out. But I will say this. I do think what you're seeing in the last 3 years is the North is starting to produce a few more schools that are knocking on the door. There's just some things missing, whether it's quarterback, whether it's line play, whether it's coaching. Penn State, to me, is a program that if they had a better head coach as a coach, would be a much more dangerous team because he can recruit now. I mean, they can recruit like crazy.
I don't trust him on game day.
Agree. Michigan is starting to knock on that door a little bit, and they're finally taking advantage of their success on the field in the recruiting now, which they hadn't done their first year because of the whole fiasco that Jim Harbaugh had with the NFL and stuff. Ohio State's Ohio State, and then of course Notre Dame. So the reality too is, Brian, and I saved this point to now. I know this is hard for Notre Dame fans because we hate Ohio State and we hate Michigan. Brian, you and I both grew up in the Midwest. I grew up as a kid in Ohio. You grew up in Indiana. You grow up kind of, I'm a Notre Dame fan, so I hate Michigan. I hate Ohio State. I hate Penn State. And that's true. But the fact of the matter is Notre Dame has to, number one, become the best school in the Midwest before they can be the best school in the country. The second part of that is, though, what I don't think people understand is it's good for Notre Dame when Michigan beats an SEC team. It's good for Notre Dame when Penn State beats an SEC team, when Ohio State beats an SEC team, because even if it's not Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's had their fair share of wins over SEC schools as well, it's just not Georgia and Alabama. When kids see the North and as a whole as a greater option, then the kids who may be prone to Notre Dame are going to be more likely to give Notre Dame an even harder look because of the fact that, hey, I can go up north and win a championship and be a high draft pick. And it's not only at Ohio State. And so, yes, it sucks to lose John Mitchell to Penn State. It does. But I'd rather him go to Penn State than Florida or Miami or Florida State. I'd rather a kid like Damon Wilson go to Ohio State than Georgia. I would have, because maybe this doesn't affect Notre Dame in this particular recruitment, but the more kids that come up to Notre Dame and Penn State and Michigan and Georgia, Michigan State and schools like that, Michigan, and have success, the greater that it opens you up, all the whole region, to northern schools. That's the reality of it. So to your point, Archer, I don't know the answer to your question, because to me is those schools have to show they can win those games before I start talking about national titles. And I'm including Ohio State in that conversation as well, because Ohio State hasn't proven they can beat those teams since 2014 either. And everybody that was associated with that 2014 Ohio State team is gone. Players, coaches, everybody. I think Mickey Marotti and Larry Johnson are like the only two coaches left from that staff, I believe. So I got to see him win it first before I go there. But I'll say this, there's a lot more northern schools knocking on the door right now than there was 5 years ago. 5 years ago was Ohio State and Notre Dame, and that was it. That was it. Penn State was a mess. Michigan was just okay. They were a good northern school like they were for decades. Wisconsin's a good northern school that can maybe beat some SEC teams in bowl games, but isn't a real legitimate title contender. And that was it. Now you're seeing more northern schools that are starting to close the gap. Now, Notre Dame needs to be careful, Brian, because if they don't have success these next couple of years, they could find themselves, like right now, I think Notre Dame is number 2. If you look at the last 5 years, they're number 2 behind Ohio State, but Michigan is nipping on their heels, and some would argue Michigan should be ahead of them. It's a different conversation for a different day, which is accurate if you're only going to look at the last 2 years. Then, yeah, Michigan deserves to be ahead of them the last 2 years. There's no question. I like to look at it 4 to 5 year options, right? They're knocking on the door. At the end of the day, until they actually win those games in the big moments, I can't project titles to the North. Look, now here's what's changed. Last year, 2 Big Ten schools made this playoffs and both lost in the first round. They lost by 6-1. That's a far cry from what had been happening, where Michigan gets blown out the year before. Notre Dame gets blown out. Ohio State got blown out by Clemson in 2016. Yeah, they lost to Clemson in a close game in 2019. They beat Clemson in 2020, and they get destroyed by Alabama in the championship game. Most of those games haven't been competitive. Last year, they were at least more competitive, but I need to see them start to win those games, Brian, before I can start to say, hey, okay, you're going to see a Northern team win the title in the next few years. They got to prove it first. That's where I'm at this point. But I will say this, where they are as a whole is better. Because, again, in 2015 to 18, 19, is if Ohio State and Notre Dame didn't win it, none of them were going to have a shot. And in most years, Notre Dame had to have everything go right to win it. Ohio State had just the better talent. The 15 team is the only one that I thought could go athlete for athlete with anybody. They just couldn't coach their way out of a wet paper bag on defense, right? It's a little different now. But and when I say proven, I don't care that you beat Auburn, who stunk. I don't care that you won that game. I don't care that Notre Dame beat Vanderbilt and South Carolina and beat LSU in years where LSU wasn't great. They were good LSU teams, but not great LSU teams. Those are good wins, but those aren't the needle movers. You got to start winning the big ones. You got to start getting playoff wins. You got to start getting Sugar Bowl wins and Orange Bowl wins and Cotton Bowl wins over those teams. That's where they need to get to. And so far, they haven't really done that. And until they do that, and that includes Ohio State, I mean, it includes all of them. So they're beating Clemson, right? Ohio State's got a win over Clemson. Notre Dame's got 2 wins over Clemson. But I'm talking about the Georgia and the Alabamas is what we're talking about here. Because that's the stumbling block. Look, LSU's not that stumbling block for teams. Not yet, anyway. I mean, maybe they will under Kelly. They're not, though. They had that one great year, and that was it. The stumbling block is not Texas A&M. It's not Florida. It's not Tennessee. It's Georgia and Alabama. That's the stumbling block. And that's who teams are shooting for. And until Northern teams start winning those games, they're closing the gap, but they're just not there yet, in my opinion. They're just not.
Agreed.
So I know it sucks, Brian, to sit there and say you need to root for those teams to win over SEC schools because we hate those teams. But it's just kind of like, but it's better for Notre Dame than the opposite, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm not rooting for Georgia, I can assure you.
Yeah. It's not that I respect the heck out of what Georgia's done. It's just like, it's kind of like this. Like this, I don't like Josh Pate had this conversation on his 247. He's like, college football doesn't need some programs to be good. I'm like, I disagree. Because a healthy college football is a college football that, like, I'm not a believer in parity the way the NFL does it. The way the NFL does it is they bring everybody down. I'm a believer in parity the way that you and I had parity when we were growing up, Brian, which is what Notre Dame and Miami were the programs, but you still had to worry about Florida State was big time. Michigan was big time. I mean, there was still a lot of Penn State was a big time program. Yes, Miami was great, but they lost to Notre Dame a couple times. They lost to Penn State in a title game. They lost to Nebraska one year. You know what I mean? Like there was still dominant programs in every part of the country. Right now, it's centralized in the Southeast, and it's really centralized between 3 teams. Ohio State's kind of getting there, on the field, but they're doing it in the draft, but not doing it on the field as much in recent years. I'm a believer that it's good for college football if Florida State's good again. It's good for Notre Dame if Florida State's good again. It's good for college football if Miami is good again, and it's good for Notre Dame. And the reason I say that is, Brian, is because Notre Dame's not going to lose a ton of kids to Florida State. But you know who is? Georgia. Bam.
Oh, they'll recruit the exact same kids.
That's the point.
We need more balance in recruiting right here
Exactly.
in the Georgia, Florida, Alabama.
Exactly.
100%.
So when LSU recruits well, that's good for Notre Dame. When Florida State recruits well, that's good for Notre Dame. When Florida and Miami are recruiting well, that's good for Notre Dame because they're going to then bring Bama down. And that's the kind of parity I like, where teams are coming down because other teams are beating them, as opposed to let's set a salary cap or let's create a draft system where if you win, you get lower picks and all this other kind of stuff. That's the way it was when we were growing up, is even though Notre Dame and Miami for a stretch were the best teams, but Bama jumps up one year and smacks Miami in the mouth. And then, then Bama goes out and gets beat by Michigan in one of the greatest bowl games ever in 2000. And, Florida wins a title one year, but then Nebraska absolutely annihilates them in another year. To me, that's good for college football. USC emerges as a powerhouse. Again, it's good for Notre Dame if USC is really good, because USC will steal some kids from Florida and Georgia and places like that from those schools. And so if they actually decide to recruit high school kids again. But that's the thing for me, is the more top level teams there are in the Southeast, the better it is for Notre Dame, because they will take some of those kids from them, especially if a couple of the ACC schools like Florida State and Miami can get good. I think that's very important for college football to have that happen.
The state of Florida was such garbage the last few years, and it might be garbage again this year. Florida State will be pretty good, but Miami's iffy. They do have a quarterback. Florida's going to be a dumpster fire. So they're not going to win 6 games. So it's not good for Notre Dame because that means a lot of kids are going to leave the state again.
Yeah. Yep. Florida State's starting to get there, though. I will say that. They're starting to win some of those battles. If they can have another 10-plus win season this year, Brian, I think Florida State's recruiting is going to take off. I really do. They still got to figure out NIL. They got to be more competitive in the NFL NIL universe. But they'll get a couple kids if they can start winning. They will. Because there's kids, I mean, there's still Florida State fans down there. There's still Florida State pockets. But right now, it's like, if I want to be an NFL player, if I want to compete for a championship, I can't go to Florida State right now. Where if they start winning, then they will. Yep. Coleman Smith asked a question, Ryan. Brian, I gotta change names. With too many Ryans and Brians and Seans and all this other kind of stuff. Is Bredell Richardson's game similar to Lorenzo Styles? Never seen his film. I would say no. His body type is similar to Lorenzo.
Bredell,
I think his game is different.
Bredell is as good a 50-50 ball guy as there is in the country, and he is the most crafty. He's more like Chris Carter.
Yeah.
I'm not saying he's Chris Carter, to be very clear. That's his style. So he's faster than he looks, but he doesn't have a fluid running motion. He's not a pretty player in that regard, but he gets behind the guy, and he'll make the ridiculous one-handed catch tiptoeing in the back of the end zone. He's got elite hands. And
that's not Lorenzo's game. And I would say Bredell's not a burner.
Nope.
Where Lorenzo's game is more about his speed. That's why I said, if you take Bredell Richardson's size out of the conversation, you're thinking he's a boundary guy. I mean, he plays more like a boundary receiver than he does a field receiver in high school, at least. And he's, and like you said, the contested ball stuff. But he's like 6'1". He's listed. How big is he really, Brian? He's listed like 6'1", 180, 185. How is he bigger? Is he bigger than that?
Yes, he's closer to 6'2", and he's 190.
Okay,
maybe a little.
So
over.
His size is getting there, but he's never going to be a big guy. But he plays like. I said this, Brian. He plays like a much bigger receiver than he is. His
ball skills are nasty.
Yeah. And his body control is very good. He knows how to manipulate defenders to get the ball, catch the ball where he wants to get it to. He's a really good player, in my opinion. Timeout Tom says, is Onye's success this spring a result of his improvement or poor guard center play?
Oh, boy.
Therefore, should Indy be concerned about luxury? I mean, guys.
Look, in spring, somebody has to lose every rep.
Exactly.
It's just the way it is.
It's about his improvement. That's what it's about. I mean, this is a kid that we said was Brian and I had on the show talked about this. Onye was super raw, but had loads of potential. He's 6'4 plus, super long arms. He went to Bishop Hendricken as a basketball player.
That's so funny, by the way.
Yes, and he became a football. I think his first year playing football was like his sophomore year. As a junior, he has like 17 sacks in a shortened season. They win a championship. Shortened season for them, compared to like a state title winner in Rhode Island's not playing 15 games like a state title winner in California or Florida is what I mean by that. And then his senior year gets wiped out because of COVID. Right. He's a raw kid with lots of talent. That's what he is. And the talent is starting to come into play. What we said when they signed him, that hopefully by year 3, you start to see it. And that's what we're starting to see.
That's the common trajectory of linemen, too. It takes longer, especially when you're, what was he, 265-ish? He's 292?
At the most. I mean, he was listed at 240 when he committed to him. And he's like 292 now. And that was my question, Brian, when I wanted to see him this spring in person was, okay, he's put the weight on, but can he keep that weight and still be athletic? That's a bigger question. But he's done that. Right. He's done that. I mean, he's done that so far. He's shown quickness and explosiveness. So, no, I'm not worried about the replacement for Josh Lugg. They're going to be fine up the middle. The offense is winning their fair share of battles as well. It's okay to just assume a positive, right? And now what we don't know is if this is going to carry over. We've seen spring breakouts that never translate to the fall. We've seen that before. So he's still got to show it on Saturdays. But, I mean, look, one of the guys he's battling with is Andrew Kristofic, and he started 9 football games. Andrew Kristofic was a starting offensive lineman for a team that didn't lose a game with him as a starter until the bowl game, right? By 3 points, Oklahoma State, a top 5 team. So we know what he can do. Is he a great player? No, but we know who he is. So if Jason Onye, and we know who Zeke Correll is, because Jason Onye is also making plays up the nose. Now, sometimes he is. The other thing too is there's a number of snaps where he's going against Notre Dame's number twos. That's also part of it. But no, there's no reason to be concerned about Jason Onye's emergence. It's only excitement. If he can take this into the fall, it's a very good sign. It's a very good sign. Got a question here from Irishman 7114. He says, is Ryan Wingo not on the board anymore? He's on the board. It's just right now he's not coming to Notre Dame. Where we talked about him earlier, Irishman, is he's the kind of kid that perhaps a big offensive season could impact.
I agree.
Because right now he wants to be an NFL pick. NIL is a factor, but I think he's the kind of kid that would overlook some NIL stuff if he felt like, you look what Notre Dame's doing offensively, and I get to play with CJ Carr, sure, I'm going to look at them again. But right now, if you're him and you're looking at Tennessee and you're looking at Bama and you're looking at Oklahoma, and you're looking at USC and schools like that, and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to compare their offense to Notre Dame's offense. Why in the world would you look at Notre Dame if you're a kid like him? There's no reason to. That, I think, is going to change when we get to the fall. So he'd be more of a kid that you would maybe get late because you stayed in it and you had a great season. But as of right now, that's not going to happen right now.
They need something. They lost their window. Yeah, they had some momentum, and I met him
early.
Before. Yeah. Like really early in his recruitment. He's a good kid. He could fit in at Notre Dame, but that doesn't mean it's going to be an easy visit to even get, let alone get his signature on National Signing Day. So when I see Tennessee is one of his prime schools, that gives me nervous. At least somebody in his camp wants NIL money, and that's not good for Notre Dame.
Yeah. Yep. All right, let's get down to some more here. We've got a question from Archer452. Follow up on the Midwestern college football. Look at QBs. Notre Dame has Hartman, Buckner, Minchie, Carr. Ohio State, McCord, Brown, Kienholz, Nolan. Michigan, JJ, McCarthy, Jaden Davis. Penn State, Aller. Will this region have the best QB play for 3 to 5 years? I mean, it's hard to say that because we need to see it on the field. I mean, of this group of players, there's only one proven player in that group, and that's Sam Hartman. And we don't know what he's going to be in a Notre Dame uniform. Everything he's proven is at Wake Forest, right? I mean, J.J. McCarthy was a game manager last year. Can he go out and beat Georgia and Bama? That remains to be seen, as it is with all these guys. So do they have a shot, Brian? Yes, and that's a big reason. But the other reason is where these schools are improving, especially Notre Dame, Ohio State, and Penn State, is the quarterback play is getting better, right? And Penn State needs Drew Aller to be legit because Sean Clifford's a great game manager. He can get you 11-2 in the Big Ten, but you're not beating Georgia and teams like that with him.
Yeah, you need somebody that can be dynamic.
But absolutely. Penn State, Ohio State, and Notre Dame, the reason that they're closing the gap is not because of the quarterback play. That's part of it. But those schools are recruiting better athletes, especially Penn State and Ohio State. Notre Dame is getting there. I think this team is going to be very athletic.
Penn State still recruiting has been Jahan Johnson. Some of those guys, those guys can freaking float.
Yes,
absolutely.
So the athleticism is getting there, because like here's the thing that I think is we're talking quarterbacks, and that's important. But you know what else is true at Notre Dame, Ohio State, and Michigan, and Penn State? They're all 4 loaded at running back for next year.
It's amazing. It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, the running back depth charts, and those are tradition-rich schools. They should be good, but they're all quote unquote up.
Yep.
So, I mean, they all have NFL running backs on their roster. That's impressive. I mean, like guys ready, not, 2, 3 now. So Singleton, holy crap, to have him and, have other guys, like he ran off guys that were 4- and 5-star players at Penn State. So that's impressive.
Yep. So I think, to me, they could be in that conversation, but look, Texas has recruited quarterback very well in recent years. Looking around, there's Clemson has recruited quarterback well the last 2 years. They have Cade Klubnik and Chris Vizina. They've recruited them. I think if he sticks with football, I'm not a huge Ty Simpson fan, Brian. I don't know what your thoughts are on Ty Simpson, but if Dylan Lonergan sticks with football and takes to coaching well, he's got tons of tools. He's very raw, very toolsy, very athletic kid. I just don't know. He may end up being a first round pick in the Major League Baseball draft and may not even play football. LSU's recruiting a quarterback is, my stance. I love Ricky Collins. You know that. They went out and got grad transfer in Jaden Davis. And that's the other part of it too, is we don't know what kids are going to move around. USC is going to have big time quarterback play in the future with him. What is Washington going to do with Kalen DeBoer? Is he going to be able to recruit and get some big time quarterbacks? So they're going to have a chance for the North to have, to me, really good quarterback play. And that's so important, because if you look at some of these teams outside of Ohio State, I mean, Notre Dame's trying to beat these teams with Ian Book and Jack Cohn, right? Michigan's trying to beat these teams, with who's the kid, Jake Rudock, right? Cade McNamara. JJ McCarthy is not that guy yet, but he's got the talent to potentially be that guy. He's a very talented kid. We saw what he did at IMG. He's got a ways to go, but you're trying to win with Shea Patterson, who I wasn't a big fan of, John O'Korn, Wilton Spate, Jake Rudock. Penn State's out there with guys like Trace McSorley, who was a nice athletic kid, but you're not beating Georgia with Trace McSorley. You're not beating those teams with Sean Clifford at quarterback. You're just not going to do it. And so when you look at it, these kids have a chance to raise the quarterback level. But at the end of the day, I don't care how good your quarterback is. When you go play Georgia, when you go play Bama, you better be darn good in the lines, and you better have some playmakers on the perimeter on both sides of the ball. That's a fact. And so what hurt – I'll say this, Brian. If the 2019 Ohio State team would have played the 2022 Georgia team, they'd have smacked Georgia. Why? Because back then Ohio State had an elite defense because they had linemen and legit NFL players in the secondary. That's been the thing that's killed Ohio State more than anything the last couple of years, is they are not that team on defense anymore. I mean, the Ohio State team that Notre Dame played in 15 had like 5 NFL first or second or third round draft picks in that secondary. And their defensive end was like Joey Bosa and Adolphus Washington and all these type NFL type, Sam Hubbard, NFL type of guys. That's where Ohio State's taking a step back. Their linebacking core in 15 was ridiculous. You look at, they had Raekwon McMillan working in at Mike with Curtis Grant, 2 5-star kids. You had Josh Perry, who was a 3rd-round pick. You had Darren Lee, who was a 1st-round pick. They were legit deep NFL on all 3 levels. What's killed Ohio State is they're not producing the secondary players and the elite skill players on defense. That's the thing is I don't care how good they are at Ohio State. There's not a team in the country, in my opinion, last year that had a better quarterback receiver group than Ohio State did. Not a one. But what happened? They still lost to Michigan because they got their butts kicked in the trenches, and they still lost to Georgia because at the end of the day, no matter how bad Georgia might have played in that game, when they needed stops, Georgia could make them, and Ohio State couldn't. That's the difference. Yeah, that 2019 Ohio State team with the secondary that they had, I'm sorry, with Justin Fields and J.K. Dobbins and the receivers they had, they beat 2022 Georgia. They do, but they're not there anymore.
Ohio State's descent, especially I think in the back 7, giving up all those plays they did to Michigan, was so shocking to me. I don't know exactly how to explain it. Somebody else that knows Ohio State better could probably do it, but they struggled. That was kind of weird, actually. It was really kind of weird.
Yep. Let's get to some more questions here. Here's one from RJG Irving I wanted to respond to. Brian, he says, I understand your tight end rationale, but can you turn down an athlete like Riddell? Well,
it's debatable.
But you can't look at it from that standpoint, Brian, because what we're talking about is you're turning down Riddell to take someone else somewhere else.
Yeah, if you were just turning him down just to blank weight is one thing.
Right.
But we're talking about trying to get a big-time D lineman, Uma or somebody like that, or maybe it's a running back, whatever.
Receiver. You want to save that spot because you think you can get a big – the other thing, too, you have to consider is Georgia turns down top 100 defensive linemen all the time.
It's
top
sad.
100 linebackers all the time because that's Notre Dame is theirs at tight end, Brian. I mean, that's the thing is you have to understand as Notre Dame fans is you can't look at it in a vacuum. And I'm not saying they're going to turn down Jaden Riddell. I'm just making the point that I could see them saying, hey, look, because here's the thing. What if the top 4 tight ends in the country wanted to come to Notre Dame? You can't take them all. You got to turn somebody down. Eventually you get to the point where like, hey, we can't have that many kids on scholarship at this position. So it's, again, you have to look at it. This is a very fair question, but you have to look at it from a bigger picture standpoint. They're not turning him down just to say, we don't like you. They haven't turned him down at all, first of all. If they decide not to take him or Carter Nelson, who has a ton of talent, it's because you want to try to get somebody at another position and because you think you can get a kid like him next year. at that position. That's the reason that you're doing it. And so it's not just turning him down and then end of story. There's a lot more context to it that I think needs to be understood before we get into, I can't believe you turn a guy like that down, because I understand that sentiment. And again, I want to be clear. I am not saying they have turned Jaden Riddell down. I'm not saying they have. I'm saying it wouldn't surprise me if they decided at some point, I think we're good with just one tight end. It would not shock me if that happens. And it's not just Jaden Riddell. It's also Carter Nelson, who I know isn't ranked as high as Jaden Riddell, and I don't have him as high as Jaden Riddell right now, but I've said this, Carter Nelson's ceiling is every bit as high as Jaden Riddell's. It's more about there's a chance they may decide that that's not where they want to go. Now, if Jaden Riddell called tomorrow and wanted to commit, I think they'd take him. I'm just saying, like, by the time these kids get into decision-making mode, depending on how Notre Dame's recruiting goes from here to then, they may say, we need to focus somewhere else, right? That's part of it too, is because these kids aren't deciding soon. Jaden Riddell said, I'm not deciding until the summer. Carter Nelson doesn't seem to be in a hurry to commit to Notre Dame. By the time they're ready to commit, Notre Dame may already have 2 backs and 3 receivers in the class.
That happens. They're out of luck.
That's my point. And so I just want to make sure people understand where I'm coming from. We're just looking at this big picture because timing of commitments also factors into this. I believe, and this is my opinion, if based on the information I've gathered, if Jaden Riddell called Notre Dame today and said, hey, I want to come, or if Carter Nelson, I think they take him. I don't think that's it, but it's about, okay, then that means I can't take a second back or I can't take a 4th receiver. What I'm saying is by the time these kids are ready to decide, I think they could be in a situation where they may say, hey, we're going to focus on other things. That's my point. And I'll make sure people understand that, because I don't want it to turn into, oh, well, Irish Breakdown saying Notre Dame's going to turn on, it's not going to take Jaden Riddell. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the way that this is going to turn out, like if you're only going to take 3 receivers, you can't not take a 3rd guy now because you want to recruit Ryan Wingo. You can't do that. Does that mean that you don't like Ryan Wingo? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means you've got to think about the timing of when things are happening to put your class together. So that's what I mean by that, and I want people to understand where I'm coming from on that one.
100%.
All right, let's get down to another one, Ryan. Here's one, Brian. Jeez Louise. I got 2 Seans, a Ryan, and a Brian that I do shows with. I did not think through the staff names very well. I need to give people nicknames. If you could allocate, so this is Andre Tonsel, and I'll ask this from you, Brian. If you could allocate those numbers from the offense to the defense, which position groups would you want to add to? So it's reference to the question we talked about with Oklahoma State, where they took away a couple of scholarships and added them to certain positions. Where would you want them to go? I know my opinion, easy. Brian. I want to hear what you'd have to say.
You follow the NFL draft. It's DN and corner traditionally. Those are not – that's the automatic. For right now, it's ironically a spot that Notre Dame has done better at history is safety. I mean, you got to adjust occasionally, and unfortunately right now they need to adjust. So maybe short term, you add an extra safety if you can get the right guy on National Signing Day or something. And they do need D-line again. So if they don't take somebody like Driscoll was talking about a minute ago with regards to tight end, and I'm not saying I agree with him, Riddell calls today. That's a pretty difficult no.
Yeah, and I don't think they would say no today.
I agree.
Right.
But I understand if they did, because they have more information about A, timeline that you were just talking about, and B, okay, they're not going to publish this in any way, but our board is X. If one of the top 2 or 3 guys like that can rush the passer calls, look, that's just a different value. I've said it a billion times. The star rankings are at least somewhat accurate, but they're really accurate when you talk about corner, pass rushers, and quarterback. A 5-star at any of those 3 spots is worth exponentially more because they change games faster than anything else. And to Driscoll's point, you got to score like you're in the big play receivers, not just good receivers, but it is 3rd and 6. There's not much you can do about it, but my guy is better than your guy. I'm throwing it up and he's winning a 50-50 ball. Yep. That means coaching's not all that important. I mean, it's just not. Right. You mean it, to a certain degree?
Or I have a route runner that's just like when this guy needs to get open, he can.
Olave right. from Ohio State's one of my favorite
Garrett
players.
Wilson. Yeah.
Oh, God, those guys just smoke people.
On 3rd and 5, I don't care if you know what's coming, if Cooper Kupp's going to still beat you. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. Or or this 6'5" guy, Marvin Harrison, to just throw it up and he's going to go make some stupid catch. I mean,
Yeah, Notre Dame's had a few of those guys, but other schools have had 2 and 3 of them.
Right.
Notre Dame, except for last year, which was obviously a receiver disaster. Every year they have a guy, but for the most part, some of the teams that are winning it, they've got 2, 3, like that 19 Alabama team had 4 guys that were legit high end. I mean, it's ridiculous. So Notre Dame needs to at least have 2 of those. So a receiver, a corner, a DN, and quarterback. Yes. Those spots, anytime you can float a scholarship to any of those 4, you got to do it.
The only thing I would change is I would be more broad in my response, and I would say D-line and secondary, because I could also make the case, okay, DN, but if you're good at DN and you get a Justin Scott type, and if I could add you know what I mean? So like there's so much flexibility. You give me a 3 technique that's disruptive, or an extra guy, or if you give me an extra, like a safety that can play multiple, like, because there's just so much interchangeableness, Brian. So overall, I agree with your point. I would just make it more broad, D-line and secondary.
Justin Scott is so rare. The most coveted spot in football is an elite nose guard, but they're so rare we don't even talk about it. What is an elite nose guard? A guy that can 2-gap, can shoot the gap, or he can run somebody down or whatever, meaning he's just massive and he's fast. Right. There's a couple of guys like Scott in every class. Notre Dame just never has them in their backyard, and that's why you guys have had 25 shows that have talked about it.
Right.
And, you know what I mean? You have to get it.
And the other thing too, Brian, about adding these positions is because the more players you have in a position, this is the reality of it, the greater odds that you have that somebody's going to pan out and give you what you need. And that's
all about the numbers, brother.
Right. So that's why I would say, I would take an extra, instead of a 6 tight end, I want 1 more D lineman, 1 more safety, 1 more corner type of thing. And that's the thing that Notre Dame has to figure out. Like, do you really need 19 offensive linemen on scholarship? How about you get down to 17, use one of those for an offensive skill, and then one of those for another defensive lineman? That's the kind of roster management that you need to have. And that's why I say fans don't quite understand. They just want to take, he's highly ranked, take him. No, you can't, right? Like, you have to think about numbers. And sometimes coaches make those mistakes. Like, to me, if I'm taking 3 linebackers in this class for Notre Dame, we'll talk about this next week, is I can't justify 2 of them being Bodie Cahoon and Cole Sullivan. Give me 1 of them and then Kingston. And then if I'm going to take a third, it's because I get Aaron Childs late, or I'm able to flip some kid late. That's really good, because you got three last year. You got Luke Talich. You've got 2 kids from the year before. You've got some other linebackers that you're in the 25 class. That's the other thing, too, is you got to make sure that when you're building up those numbers that you're making sure that you're smart about. I'm not going to bring a guy in who's just a good depth player. At some point in time, you got to say, hey, we got to shoot for the stars here. And I think we're seeing that on offense. The defensive staff, I'm a little shaky on with that right now, to be honest with you.
Understood.
All right, let's get to the next question here from Irvin Castaneda. Thank you, Irvin. Just logging in, and you may have discussed already, but how did the visit with Gallegos go? As a Mexican-American, I would really love to get more Mexican-Americans to be Notre Dame fans. How he would help. Go Irish. Well, I haven't heard a lot back so far, to be honest with you, because right now Ryan's on vacation. I did check in today, and I heard it went well. It wasn't like a earth-shattering, needle-moving visit for Marquise, but I think Notre Dame did well. It was Easter weekend, so it's a little bit of a different kind of weekend. They're in the game there with Marquise. I don't know if I would say they're the leader right now. I think there's some other schools out west that he likes a little bit more. But it was a good enough visit to where you've got a shot to bring him back for an official. And that was really the goal with Marquise coming into the weekend, was, can you do well enough to get him back for an official? And I think they did well enough for that. I think another thing that would help is I honestly would be very curious, or I'd be very interested to see how the games went for the NFL because anytime you're going to travel abroad, I always worry about security for the players and stuff. This is whether you're playing in Ireland or Rome or whatever. But I would really like to see Notre Dame, if you're going to play a neutral site game, I wouldn't mind to see them play in Mexico City like the NFL has done. Because to the point is my understanding is in Mexico especially, there's a very heavy Catholic presence, is my understanding. I could be wrong, but that's my understanding. And if Notre Dame did more to promote the game down there, I think you could see that, because I know we've had some on our show, some either not just Mexican Americans, but Mexicans that will listen to the show. If you look at our numbers, Brian, we get a decent number of people that listen, because I can look at it and see where in the world people are listening.
Right.
We have like a map, and we get a decent number from Mexico.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And so now, like, there's a lot, like some from like Thailand, but those are mostly like service members, like soldiers and stuff that are stationed in other places. But Mexico is a place where we tend to get a lot of listeners. So it wouldn't shock me if someday Notre Dame played a game in Mexico City, and it is an attempt to kind of say, hey, look, we want to build up a bigger fan base down here.
Absolutely.
And I could see something like that as well. So I'm actually going to look at my numbers for the last month, because I'm very interested in that. But yeah, like, so like if you look at all the other countries, Canada is number one, but two of the bigger countries that we get listeners from that are not Canada are, I think, if I'm looking at this correctly, see here, yeah, Mexico and Brazil and Belize. Can you believe that? Belize are both top 10 places. Philippines is number 3 behind U.S. and Canada. But again, that's because there's a lot of service members that are.
I was getting ready to say, it's got to be military, right?
Okay. Yeah, because there's military bases over there. And then United Kingdom, 1,700, Germany, 1,600. Again, Germany is a lot about the military bases that we have there. And then it's Mexico, Belize, New Zealand, Australia. So, and then Brazil's got a decent number as well. So it is kind of fascinating to look at this. I can actually go through the map and look at like different countries and see like, okay, that's interesting. Like, why would we have numbers from there? Like, I'm trying to look at, there was one that we saw recently, 38 from Egypt, 38 downloads in the last week from Egypt, right? So it's kind of funny. 2 from South Africa. There was a country in Africa recently that we looked at. We was looking at these numbers, and there was like 50 downloads from this country in Africa. And I was like, okay, it's wild. I wouldn't have expected that. 191 in Saudi Arabia, 187 in Jordan. So yeah, it's pretty wild, man. It's pretty fun. Italy's 317. So it's pretty cool to see those kind of numbers. It really, and then some there's like 0, none from Russia, but I don't know if they necessarily report them. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. I just find it fascinating to see that stuff. So I could see something like that. I could see something like that where Notre Dame has a game once a decade or something like that in Mexico City. It wouldn't shock me to see them do that. What would you think about something like that, Brian?
As long as you figure out the logistics and you can get the other team to agree to them as well.
All right.
The question is, how does the money work and all that? Because there's no nice way to say this. The political nature between the United States and Mexico is not very friendly.
Right now, it's not, for sure, yeah.
And it's not going to be anytime soon. So, well, it sounds good. I don't see that happening.
The NFL does it. And that's the thing. That's what I would want to find out from the NFL is like, how does it work? Like, what does it work? What's the process like?
The only way I can see that is the NFL is throwing so much money at Notre Dame is not very friendly with giving money away either. So that's another thing. NFL is the richest sports. Like they kill it. So except for a couple of the leagues in soccer in Europe, they're pretty much it.
Yeah. Be interesting. Be very interesting. Let's get to, I have a 2-part question here from Insured by Big, who's one of our LSU fans. Archer452 is a Ohio State fan. Antoine Johnson's a Michigan fan. We'll have him coming up here too. So I do love the fact that we have fans from other fan bases that listen. And you guys need to check out our CFB Nation channel, because we're going to have a lot more stuff that's going to talk national stuff here moving forward. But Insured by Big says, recruiting to me is absolutely the most challenging part of a program. Every kid's wants are different, and trying to project a kid's talent from high school to college is so unknown. To LSU fan here, but Notre Dame is going to be a problem for years to come. I believe NIL will start to settle too, and Notre Dame fans need not to be so negative on recruiting, start looking at the talent they get. What you have to understand is a lot of that negativity comes from BK PTSD. It's what happened during the Brian Kelly era, which is for so long. This isn't Brian Kelly hate. This is just reality. They settled for far too long. They were just not a legit player for big-time players. They just wouldn't even fight those fights. And so Notre Dame fans have just kind of been conditioned to assume they're not going to get those kids. And and it's not just BK PTSD. It goes all the way back to Ty, Lorenzo Booker. And remember when everybody thought we all thought we were going to get Sean Cody, right? Sean Cody's I grew up a Notre Dame fan, and then they don't get him. They would just, This has been going on for a long time. And so I think Notre Dame fans are still struggling to adjust to the idea that Marcus Freeman has changed the game. Even with NIL, Marcus Freeman has changed the game. And so many Notre Dame fans, too, because it's funny that I find fans from other, not always, because I don't think Archer has a proper view of Notre Dame's talent level, but I talk to a lot of fan bases, and they're like, dude, Notre Dame concerns me. And you got LSU people. This is an LSU guy saying that. I think Antoine's talked about that in the past. But they're seeing it because they're the ones losing some of these kids they don't normally lose to Notre Dame, whereas Notre Dame fans are still too focused on the guys they lost. Well, they didn't get Keon, they get Peyton Bowen, and those are huge losses. But then they don't put enough on. But do you know how big it was to get Jeremiah Love? Do you know how big it was to get Christian Gray? You beat Ohio State and LSU for him. Do you know? Trust me, LSU hired his high school football coach, and you still beat them for him. Those are when people debate DBU right now, like modern DBU. Who's the debate between, Brian? It's OSU or LSU, 100%. Right? You beat both of them for Christian Gray. That doesn't happen very often. This is what we said about Benjamin Morrison. Notre Dame doesn't often go beat Alabama and Washington when Jimmy Lake was still there for DB. Washington was killing Notre Dame in the secondary. They wanted Trent McDuffie. They wanted Kyler Gordon. Mike Elko loved Kyler Gordon. He was his number one corner, and he got beat by Jimmy Lake for him. They've been killing Notre Dame in secondary recruiting. And so there's still this too much of a focus from Notre Dame fans on the guys they lost without recognizing, do you know how huge it was to get 3 dudes from Texas at receiver last year? Do you know how big it was to get Christian Gray and Jeremiah Love out of St. Louis and the teams you had to beat for them? Like, and they're just, do you know how big it was to go down into Baton Rouge and beat LSU and the SEC, Texas A&M and all those schools for Jaden Osbury? Do you all understand how big that is? And I don't think there's enough weight being put on that. And that's what now, do you need to start getting the Keon Keeleys? Yes, you do. Do you need to start winning the Peyton Bowen battles? Absolutely you do. But they're winning a lot more of those battles than they have in the past. And that's the argument that I made a couple weeks ago when there was the question of, oh, Notre Dame's not recruiting any better under Marcus Freeman than Brian Kelly. There's no metric that you can use to say that's true. None. Last 10 years, 2 of the 3 highest ranked recruiting classes from 24/7's own point system were the 2 classes that Marcus Freeman basically put together as the DC / head coach and then as a head coach. The blue chip ratio the last 2 years blows away what it was before. The 7 years before, Brian, the blue chip ratio, which is 4 and 5 stars and 3 stars, basically percentage, was in the 54%. In the last 2 years under Marcus Freeman, it's in the 80s. It's not even close. It's not there yet, but it's getting there. And I think he gets it, but I think Notre Dame fans are understandably conditioned to expect the worst. And to obsess over recruiting rankings to a point where it's like, I think you guys are kind of missing the boat a little bit on this. And so that's why want to know why I'm fired up about this team? Because I see the jump in talent, not just on film, but then I go to the practices and I'm like, there's so many more athletes now than there was before. Guys right now that are struggling to be on the second team that in 2020 would have played a ton if not started. Like, think about it. Clarence Lewis is battling to be Notre Dame's number 3, maybe number 4 corner. He started on their 2020 playoff team.
That means
he's struggling to be your number 3 right now.
That's right.
Yeah.
That means Notre Dame's headed in the right direction. And that's right. Only through recruiting, period.
That's right. Jabron Payne in 2019 is the number 2 running back behind Kyron Williams. Easily. Right now, he's battling to be number 5, number 4. Oof. Right?
That's hard to imagine.
A different animal.
Yeah. Notre Dame has a lot better chance to survive, and I'm not saying I want this, but if an injury happens to somebody, you can pick a position.
Right.
Except for safety, where there's no way around it. That spot's it just can't happen. Other than that, the skill spots and all that line, they're pretty good shape.
Right. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. Now the thing is, we'll admit they've got to close on some of those they've got to close on some more good defensive linemen. They've got to close on a couple more skill guys. There's no doubt. They have not arrived yet. All I'm trying to say is we can say that they haven't arrived yet, but still enjoy the fact that, boy, they're further along than people realize. And that's what gets me fired up. Even with the losses that they've had, Brandon Hillman, losing him sucked. Losing Keon Keeley sucked. Peyton Bowen sucked. But it doesn't take away from the fact of how good last year's class still was. And that's what has me fired up. It does. It does. And, I mean, the guys we're talking about today, Brian, Jason Robinson, they don't get him 2-3 years ago. I have no way. There's no chance that Dell Alexander gets Jason Robinson 2-3 years ago. None.
Yeah, probably wouldn't have called him.
None. Last year's receiver class wouldn't have looked anything like it did if Dell Alexander's still here. Nothing like it did.
He was a terrible recruiter.
So that's just the reality of it. And so, yeah, they got to get better. But it's come a long way, and that's what's exciting. And you know, where Brian Kelly deserves credit is they have a better product to sell to people. They won a lot of games against teams they were supposed to beat, and that's the thing that Marcus Freeman's got to do this year. So it's going to be fun. We got a last couple here, Brian, before we get out of here. Antoine Johnson says, Brian, do you think there's a way for any college schools to help public schools with their programs locally, perhaps some type of partnership in athletics and academics? This could help both sides. Unfortunately, the NCAA makes that very hard.
I was getting ready to say the same thing.
Yeah.
They don't want the schools around the kids except for very discrete, specific times, end all be all.
Now,
well, that's hard.
Where it can get where I think you can help, and this is the thing is I mean a lot of things that I think could help academics to me would be a completely different show that would cover things that really don't have a lot to do with football. And so I don't really care to go there. But the reality is to your point, Antoine, is I would love it if there was ways that colleges could help, you know, these schools in that regard. But if it was something that was related to academics at all or athletics at all, it immediately becomes just a big no-no for the NCAA. You know, like Alabama can't donate money to help build up, you know, in-state school, whatever, because then it's going to look like, well, you're just doing this to entice kids to come. And I mean, honestly,
they would be.
It's exactly. I mean, they would be spending money at places where the top kids already are coming from. It wouldn't actually help.
This is rare for me to say this, but the NCAA would have a point. I hate the NCAA, but they would have complete. I get it.
So it'd be awesome, but it's just not going to happen. Yeah, it's just not going to happen.
No. Here's
one from Josh Buffo, the motivational business banker. I'm hearing a lot of this. I'm going to ask this question, Brian. I'm going to let you speak on this first. It says, guys, if Ryan Day loses to Notre Dame and Michigan this year, is he fired? So basically goes 10-2 in the regular season, loses to road games to Notre Dame and to Michigan.
There's three answers to this that all go together. If he gets smoked by both Notre Dame and Michigan, that's different than Michigan scores on the last play of the game. JJ throws a fade ball or something. You know what I mean? That's one part. Two, you better be careful what you ask for. The famous thing that, and Driscoll and I laugh about this all the time on the phone. It's not who you fire. It's who you hire.
Right.
Who the hell is going to come in and magically discontinue this at Ohio State?
Who's going to want that job? If
That's what I'm saying.
Ryan Day after the run he's had, people are looking and say, there's no way I'm taking that job.
People want a job where they're going to be respected. The money's insane. Even at crappy jobs, you're making seven figures. That's just true. So why would I put because at Ohio State, like whoever the head coach's wife or kid, they're going to get ridiculed if you lose a game. Ohio State fans are horrendous. They're my least favorite fan base in the country. It's debatable, but they would be my number one gun to head. Also, like Brian said, if you're going to do that, you would set a precedent for not just the current administration, but potentially long term. Don't think about that. And then finally, how did he do in the other games? Ohio State, except for those two games that are mentioned in this question, what do you think, Driscoll? Is there a game that they're not favored by 15 or more out of the other games? If they lose one of those others,
Penn State maybe.
Yeah, Penn State might be 9 or something like that. That's possible. But they should win every other game by 2 scores or more. If he's winning 27-24 to Indiana or something, and he loses those two, whole different ballgame. Because then you can see deterioration. At least there would be some plausible. But even then, again, who are you going to hire?
Right.
Every fan base is under this ridiculous illusion that the next guy is going to be better.
Yeah.
Who's the messiah that's coming up in college football right now? There isn't even one. There's nobody we're even talking about for any job.
Well,
This is
Notre
a
Dame fans are
horrific year.
thinking, well, they're afraid that if Notre Dame beats Ohio State, then Ohio State's going to come for Marcus Freeman, and maybe they do. But my whole
I
thing
don't
is
know.
if you're Marcus Freeman, why the heck would you? Again, they just fired a coach who was hugely successful.
Yeah, and I
Hugely
guarantee you they
successful.
know each other. I
Yes.
guarantee he wouldn't like them. I would bet heavily Marcus would take the phone call at his alma mater.
Sure.
He wouldn't take the job.
You're talking about a
Ohio
guy,
State fans wouldn't
Ryan,
believe
that's
that.
45-6, and he's 31-2 in conference. The fact that we're even talking about him being fired is just says the absurdity of Ohio State fans.
That's why I said they're the
You
worst.
just lost to the national champions by a freaking point in the playoff, right? Like, there's a lot of teams would trade positions with you in a heartbeat. Like, and there's this other notion. So, well, they fired John Cooper because he lost to Michigan. Not really. That was the reasoning, but let's not act like they fired John Cooper after a 10-2 season. They fired John Cooper after he had 2 years in a row where they went 14-10. They went 6-6 and 8-4. They finished 8th and 4th in the Big Ten his last 2 years. If they were still winning 11-10 games a year, it'd have been a whole lot harder to fire John Cooper. There's no question
sucked against Michigan, but your
Yes.
point was kind of like mine. If you're struggling against Indiana and Illinois and schools like that, the alumni are going to take that a lot more personal. Although they hate Michigan more, they still respect them more too. To get beat by Michigan is not it's not a terrible. To get beat by Illinois, that's not.
I think the other thing too is we have to understand is the Notre Dame, the Ohio State fan base does not speak for the Ohio State administration. And Ryan Day is going to have a bad season for him to be.
He's got to go 4-8 or something,
or 6-6, 7-5. Like, here's the thing: if they get smacked, let's say they get smacked by Notre Dame, they lose again to Michigan, 3rd year in a row. They get beat at home by Penn State, and let's say go to a bowl game, and let's say they go to the Outback Bowl or something and get smacked by South Carolina. Maybe. But the other thing too is if you're smart, you're only doing that because who's going to replace them. You've got somebody lined up to replace them. And who's that going to be? Right? Like Lincoln Riley's not coming to Ohio State. Nick Saban's not coming to Ohio State. Maybe Marcus Freeman, but that's a big risk too, because you're talking about a guy that for all the success. And here's the thing. What would make Marcus Freeman attracted to Ohio State? He goes to a playoff game. Well, if you're Marcus Freeman and you just went to the playoff of Notre Dame and Ohio State just fired a coach who'd been in the playoff how many times in recent years? Because he had one down year, pass. Because look, Brian Kelly went 4-8 in 4-8 in 2016 and didn't get fired. He'd only had 2 10-win seasons in the previous 5 years. That's it. He didn't get fired.
Notre Dame has more credibility with coaches because of that.
Way more in that regard.
It's just the way it is.
So, and I'm not even arguing that Kelly should have been fired. I'm just saying, if he goes 4-8 at Ohio State this year, he's getting fired. Look at Dan Mullen. He's in the SEC title. He won 2 major bowl games in a row, right, at Florida, and has a down year and they fire him. It's I don't know if people want to do. The guy went 10-3, 11-2, 8-4 in a year they played in the SEC championship game. And then they've won the Peach Bowl. They've won the Orange Bowl. His lowest season in ranking in his 3 years at Florida was 13th. And that was the year they played Bama in the SEC title game. They finished 7th, 6th, and 13th overall. The next year he goes 5-6, and he gets fired.
Welcome to the Southeastern Conference.
Yeah. The point is they replaced him with Billy Napier. Okay. Can you guarantee me that Billy Napier is going to be better than Dan Mullen? No, you can't. And Florida's not in nearly good a situation as Ohio State. So again, I'm not saying that Ohio State fans won't want him fired, but Gene Smith is not a moron. And I think you'd have to be a moron to fire Ryan Day for any other reason than just he does something immoral, which I've never heard anything about Ryan Day being that. I've never heard anything like that about him in that regard, where he's out there doing some of the stuff that Lane Kiffin and some of these other coaches have done in their, tenures as coaches. Ed Orgeron was doing. So I just, barring another collapse, Brian, which, Ohio State could just roll the ball out and win 9 games next year. Let's be honest about that. They can play like garbage and still win 9 games next year against the teams on their schedule. They can. It's Penn State, Notre Dame, and Michigan. That's it. That's really the only teams that can beat them on their schedule. That's it.
Unless they beat themselves.
Right, exactly. And even then, there's games last year where I thought they played like trash and still won by 14 points because they're just so much more talented than everybody else in their conference other than Michigan or Penn State. So I just Ryan or Brian, I just feel like we far too often we get into these things of we believe that the school believes this because the fans believe this. And I just have a hard time believing that Ryan Day being fired is even remotely a topic of conversation amongst administrators at Ohio State. And it shouldn't be, to be honest
Gene
with you.
Washington's not that stupid.
Right. Yeah, it sucks you lost to Michigan. You went to the freaking college football playoffs and took the defending national champs and eventual national champs down to the wire. Where in reality, you probably outplayed them longer in that game than they outplayed you. And if your star receiver doesn't get hurt, maybe you win. Maybe you win. So I have a hard time believing that. I do. I have a hard time believing that. Fickle and Vrabel. What's Mike Vrabel done with the Titans? What's Luke Fickell done without Marcus Freeman at Cincinnati or Marcus Freeman's recruits at Cincinnati? Like, do you really want to take that gamble? I don't.
That would be their next phone call.
Yeah.
But that's the whole point. There aren't any. Right now is a very awkward time in college football. So good luck to them if they decide to part ways with Ryan Day. And I'm not saying he's a savior. Right. I'm just saying be careful what you ask for.
And I would be willing to bet that they would probably go to Fickell or Vrabel before they go to Freeman. Unless Notre Dame's winning a championship next year.
They have a lot more coaching experience. That's hard.
Yeah. Not saying that they should, but you know me, I'm not a big Luke Fickell guy. We'll find out at Wisconsin how good of a coach he is. But so that's my thing is, Brian, is I hear, and I have family in Ohio. Believe me, I hear the Ryan Day complaining when I go back home and visit my family. Trust me, I get it. But as I've learned my entire life, Ohio State fans wanted John Cooper fired years before he actually got fired. They didn't fire him until he started losing. That's just the reality of it. And I feel the same way now. Like it just, man, that would make that job so unattractive. And here's the thing. You don't really want to be the coach that walks into that situation. It's like with Florida. Best thing that ever happened to Urban Meyer is the fact that he didn't have to replace Steve Spurrier. He got to replace the guy that replaced the guy. You know what I mean? And that's where you want to be. You 100%. Want to be the guy that replaces the guy. You don't want to be the guy that replaces Jimmy Johnson. You want to be the guy that replaces the guy that replaced Jimmy Johnson. That's the reality of it. And that's what's going to make the Bama job really interesting if Saban ever decides to retire. I don't even know if he will. Honestly,
he might die in his office.
I'm serious. I'm not trying to be flippant when I say that. Like
he's not going to be able to sit at home with his wife. He can't do it.
Yeah, some people are that way. Some people are that way. So yeah, we'll see. Let me ask you this question, Brian. Let's say they go 10-2. They get absolutely. Let's say they have a 10-2 season like Notre Dame in 2006. Remember that one? Where Notre Dame only lost 2 games, but they got obliterated by Michigan and beat handily by USC, although the USC loss points-wise was similar to the Michigan loss, but Michigan thoroughly outplayed Notre Dame.
Yeah,
Notre Dame didn't play well against USC, but USC had better players. Notre Dame competed for a little while in that game. And then they have a bowl game like Notre Dame had in the Sugar Bowl, where they go to a bowl game and just get destroyed. I could see that maybe being a scenario where they say, hey, we got to make a change. We got to make a change in this situation because we've regressed as a program. We played 4 good teams this year and 3 of them just blew us out. That might be something that maybe could convince them to make it. But even then, Brian, I just don't see it.
I say it again. Who are you going to hire? So good luck.
Yeah. That's when LSU fired Orgeron, there were multiple big-time coaches that they could go get. They wanted Lincoln Riley, didn't work out. So who do they turn to? Brian Kelly. I don't know if there's that kind of market right now for those kind of coaches because those guys just got hired. Like Brian Kelly's not leaving LSU to go to Ohio State, in my opinion. Right? Lincoln Riley's not leaving USC to go to Ohio State. You're going to have to take your chances with Luke Fickell and Mike Vrabel, maybe Marcus Freeman. So I don't see it. And I also don't see Ohio State taking the step back that a lot of people think they will. Their offensive line's not that good. Well, their offensive line wasn't very good 2 years ago, and they won the Rose Bowl. Their offensive line wasn't great last year, and they went to the college football playoff.
Their
You
skill
know?
talent is so good on
Yeah.
offense that they just
But
flat out beat team on
they
that.
lose CJ Stroud, and they're gonna have a first time start. CJ Stroud had 0 career passes when he took over in 2021. 0. Right? Like, they're gonna be fine at quarterback. You know, is Kyle McCord as good as CJ Stroud? I don't think so. But the talent around him is gonna be loaded. And they're going to probably be healthier at running back. You get Evan Pryor back from injury. Dallin Hayden's going to be year 2 guy. Mayan Williams and Travion Henderson are healthier. You're good there. You're going to have a loaded receiving core. You bring everybody back from your receiving core that actually played last year, because Jackson Smith and Jigma didn't even hardly play last year. And you bring in arguably the best receiving core in the country. Like, they're going to be fine. You know, will they beat Notre Dame and Michigan? We'll find out. I actually think they're going to beat Michigan. I have Ohio State going 11-1 next year. I do. I think they'll lose Notre Dame. Just my early prediction. I think they'll beat Penn State, and I think they'll beat Michigan, because they get Penn State at home, and they'll beat Penn State at home. Penn State will play them tough, because Penn State always plays Ohio State tough. I got to give James Franklin that, man. He, even when his teams aren't that good, they compete against Ohio State, even when they lose. And I think they'll beat Michigan. I don't think they're going to lose to Michigan 3 years in a row. I just don't see it. I really don't see it.
I like Michigan in that one. I just
don't.
They've got their number right now, so I don't know.
They do, but I have a hard time seeing that 3 years in a row.
McCarthy is going to be better is the reason I'm picking it.
I think
he
so.
didn't even do a lot in the last game, and they smoked.
I think he'll be better. I don't think the offensive line is going to be as good.
No,
I don't think, I don't think the defense is going to be as good. I don't. And I think something else too, Brian. I'll say this, and people may disagree with this. My thing with Michigan too and Ohio State too this year is I think that not having CJ Stroud is going to help Ohio State from a coaching standpoint, not as a team.
Just relying on him.
Yes, they put way too much on CJ's shoulders last year.
Especially that Georgia game.
Yes. Yeah. Whereas this year, I feel like they're going to say, hey, we don't have CJ. Yes, we have great receivers, but we're going to need to be a little bit more balanced. And I think that's going to make them better, in my opinion, because then it was harder to do that last year too, because the running back injuries that they had throughout the year. I mean, Travion was never healthy. Mayan was banged up it was in and out of the lineup. When he was in it, he was rushing for 100 yards. Then he was out. Dallin Hay was a rookie. Then he got hurt late. Evan Pryor tore his ACL before the season even started. Those guys are all back. And I believe Trayanum's moved to running back last year too, right? Then he came to Ohio State to play linebacker. I think they moved.
They had some injuries, so I don't know what he's doing
there or not, but they'll be fine.
They'll be fine there.
Yeah. Ohio State's not going to take this big step back that people think that they will. They're not. I just think that's Ohio State fans just being like, but I'll say this, Brian, I long for the day that Notre Dame fans are complaining about seasons like Ohio State's having. I would love that to be the case. I'm not going to lie to you. We're complaining about 9-4. I would much rather be there. And I think they'll get there. I think they'll get there. So, we'll see. I think that the thing that's hurt Ryan Day is Ryan Day likes to show everyone how smart he is. That's my issue with Ryan Day. Instead of just saying, hey, we got better players than them. Let's go be that. And I just think his unwillingness, because here's the thing, and you learn this about coaches, the further and further away he's gotten from Urban Meyer, the more he's been pass heavy. And I think that's what made that 19 team so good, in my opinion. Ryan is that first Ryan Day team, really the first 2 Ryan Day teams, but especially that first Ryan Day team, they were incredibly balanced. I mean, really balanced. I mean, they averaged 46.9 points per game. They averaged 266.79, 266.8 yards per game. And then they also had a quarterback that passed for 41 touchdowns and 3 picks. They averaged 263.1 passing yards per game, 266.8 rushing yards per game. They were a very balanced team. And just the further and further away that they've gotten from that, the more pass heavy they become. And in 2021, they're down 80 yards passing or rushing. They're down to 180.3. Still good, but 180.3. They're passing for a bunch of yards, 369.6 by the starter, 380.9 for the team. This past year, they're at 298 passing and then 192 rushing, so a little bit better, but a lot of that was because they had some blowout games where they just didn't throw the ball a ton. To me, Ohio State needs to be a team that needs to be more balanced, because when you get into the late season games against a Michigan, when it's cold and the weather's not great, like nothing pissed me off more than listening to Ohio State fans whine about the weather in the Michigan game in 2021.
It's in the
You are in
Midwest on
Columbus,
Thanksgiving.
Ohio. They're in Ann Arbor. You and I grew up watching that game because we'd watch that game at noon and then we watched Notre Dame USC or whatever else coming afterwards. I don't remember very many games that were 70 and sunny. So if you're a coach and you're complaining about the weather in Ohio in November, you're an idiot and you didn't build your team correctly. That's my thing about this, Brian, is that's a you problem. And when Ohio State was owning Michigan for those years, they could compete with Michigan in the trenches, if not outplay them, right? The fact that you're complaining about how cold it was and how that hurts your offense, you are at Ohio State. If you can't run the football at Ohio State, that's on you. If you're losing games because the weather wasn't conducive to our style of play, that's a you problem.
Yeah, you know what state you're in. It's not. That was
right.
Yeah, they didn't do a good enough job with O-line recruiting. The running back situation was a little beat up, but Dallas Hayden's a hell of a player.
Style of play. It's also you didn't build yourself to be physical and tough, and that's the thing too. Is you got to build you don't just turn that switch on in week 13, game 12, and we're going to be physical this week. We've been out athleting people every week. We're going to turn to physical. It's got to be 100%. Who you are.
I agree.
And that's what to me Ryan Day's not doing. It's they don't instill the toughness like they did it against Notre Dame. But you know why they were that way against Notre Dame? And this is why I think if they don't change their ways is why I think it's going to hurt them against Notre Dame this year. They had the whole fall camp to get ready for that physicality against Notre Dame. And then they went away from it the rest of the year. By the time they got to Michigan, they weren't that team anymore, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so that's what he's got to fix, in my opinion. It's not talent or anything. It's mental. Who do you want to be? Because the minute you start complaining, here's what I can promise you, Brian. Wherever you play that game, Michigan, Ohio State game, chances are it's going to be pretty cold. It's going out on a limb here that either Columbus or Ohio are in
40 degrees or less
in late November, right? So if you're not building your team to be able to handle those moments, then that's on you.
By the way, my computer is about to die. So
okay, sounds good. Well, that was the last question we had. Great time to have it. I want to thank everybody for being with us today on the show. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today, man. I always love talking ball with you. We'll let you know when we know exactly what we're going to do, but Brian and I are in the process of figuring out what kind of show he's going to have on CFB Nation. He's going to talk recruiting, Florida, Georgia, something along those lines. Because CFB Nation is meant to be a national channel. This is the Notre Dame channel. So we're going to have some fun talking about that stuff. So make sure you're subscribing to the CFB Nation channel on the podcast platform and on YouTube, because we're going to have a lot of stuff going on here. So I want to thank you all for being with us today. Had a lot of fun. We'll be back tomorrow at 1:00 on our normal time. Tonight, obviously CFB or IB Nations or IB Sports Talk tonight at 6:00. We'll be back. So have that show. Hit that like button, folks. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notification bell. Share this podcast. And of course, sign up for the message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Thanks for having us. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for having us on your TV, computer, whatever the case may be. We'll talk to you again soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.